The morning alarm. My name is Takeshi Yamamoto, and I need to tell someone about the alarm clock that won't stop ringing in the empty apartment next to mine. I moved into my Shibuya studio apartment in September of 2024. The rent was reasonable, 78,000 yen monthly, because the building was old with thin walls. As a salaryman on a modest salary, I was grateful for anything affordable near the station. The apartment was typical Tokyo housing. 6 tatami mats, small kitchen, unit bath. Through the paper-thin walls, I could hear everything from neighboring units. The middle-aged woman below watched morning variety shows. The elderly man across the hall coughed every morning at 6:30. And from the apartment directly to my right, I heard another salaryman's daily routine. His alarm went off every weekday at exactly 5:47 a.m., not 5:45 or 6 o'clock, but 5:47 precisely. The harsh electronic beeping continued for exactly 12 minutes before stopping. During those 12 minutes, I heard him moving around. Shower running 5 minutes, hair dryer 2 minutes, drawers opening, belt buckle hitting the floor, footsteps pacing. At exactly 6 a.m., his front door would slam, followed by footsteps down the metal stairs. I never saw him, but his routine became part of mine. When his alarm sounded, I knew I had 1 hour 28 minutes before my own alarm at 6:15. It was like a gentle warning that day was beginning. This continued for 3 weeks. Then, on October 3rd, everything changed. His alarm went off as usual at 5:47, but after 12 minutes of beeping, I didn't hear the shower. Instead, there was a heavy thumping sound, like something falling, followed by furniture scraping across tatami mats. Then silence until my alarm rang. I thought maybe he was sick, but Wednesday brought the same pattern alarm: beeping, thump, scraping, silence. No shower, no footsteps down the stairs. By Friday, I was concerned. The pattern continued every morning. I started lying awake from 5:30, listening carefully. The thumping was always in the same spot, right against our shared wall where his futon must be. The scraping moved from the sleeping area toward where his entrance door would be. On Saturday morning, I took action. When his alarm rang, yes, even weekends I went into the hallway and knocked after the beeping stopped. "Excuse me, are you all right in there?" No response. I knocked louder. "This is Yamamoto from next door. Is everything okay?" Nothing. I pressed my ear to the door and heard that familiar thump, then scraping across the floor, then silence. This continued for days, every morning at 5:47. Alarm, beeping, thump, scraping, silence. I never heard his door open or footsteps on the stairs. On October 10th, I contacted the building superintendent, Watanabe-san, an elderly man who managed the property. "Watanabe-san, I wanted to ask about the tenant in 304 next to mine." His expression changed, becoming serious and cautious. "What about 304? I've been hearing unusual sounds in the morning. I wanted to make sure my neighbor is all right. I haven't seen him in over a week." Watanabe-san set down his broom and looked at me carefully. "Yamamoto-san, there is no current tenant in 304. It has been vacant since early September." My stomach dropped. "Vacant? But I hear his alarm every morning. I hear him moving around." The previous tenant was Sato-san, a young salaryman like yourself. He died on September 28th. Heart attack. The paramedics found him when he didn't show up for work. September 28th. That was the Monday before October 2nd. The first day, I noticed the change in routine. How did he die? Koroshi, death from overwork. Sato-san was only 28, but had been working excessive hours for months. The stress caused his heart to give out. Where did they find him? In his sleeping area, right against the wall, shared with your apartment. He was getting dressed for work when it happened. His alarm clock was still beeping when paramedics arrived, probably going off for over an hour. The thumping sound, the scraping. I understood what I'd been hearing. Has anyone been inside since then? His family collected belongings 2 weeks ago. It's been empty since. He looked at me directly. You haven't been hearing anything, have you? In Japan, we don't discuss spiritual disturbances openly, but I needed to understand. Every morning at 5:47, I hear his alarm. 12 minutes of beeping, then sounds like someone falling and being dragged across the floor. Watanabe-san nodded grimly. Sato-san died while getting ready for work. His morning routine was everything to him, never missed, even when exhausted or sick. His alarm was an old electric model, very loud, that doesn't stop until physically turned off. But how can it still ring if the apartment's empty? The electricity hasn't been turned off yet. But Yamamoto-san, those old alarms don't have automatic settings. Someone has to set them. We stood in uncomfortable silence. What should I do? Sato-san's spirit may be trapped in his morning routine. The routine was so important, so deeply ingrained, that death couldn't break the pattern. There are Buddhist practitioners who help with these situations, but first, you should see the apartment yourself. The next morning, I woke at 5:30 and waited. At exactly 5:47, the alarm began beeping through the wall. After 12 minutes and the familiar sounds, Watanabe-san met me with the master key. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded, hands shaking. He unlocked 304. The layout was identical to mine, but reversed sleeping area directly against our shared wall. The apartment was mostly empty, except for a low table, some books, and on the floor where the futon would be, an old electric alarm clock still plugged in. The clock was silent, hands pointing to 6:07 a.m. What made my blood run cold was seeing the alarm hand positioned at exactly 5:47, switch turned to on. Every morning, this clock somehow set itself to ring, even with no one there. Look at the floor, I whispered. Deep scuff marks crossed the tatami mats from the wall area to the entrance door. Consistent marks, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly along the same path. He was getting dressed here every morning, Watanabe-san said quietly. Set alarm for 5:47, got up when it rang, showered and dressed in this spot, then headed for the door. On September 28th, his heart gave out putting on clothes, right against your wall. Paramedics said he struggled for several minutes. The scuff marks perfectly matched the scraping sound. He's still trying to get to work. Yes, every morning at 5:47, unless something breaks the pattern. Watanabe-san unplugged the alarm clock. If it can't sound, maybe he can't begin his routine. That night, I waited for 5:47. Complete silence. No beeping, thumping, or scraping. I felt relieved, but strangely sad. Sato-san was trapped in his final morning, unable to complete the routine that defined him. Unplugging his alarm felt like abandoning him. I researched his company online and found an obituary mentioning his dedication and habit of arriving earlier than anyone else. He never took sick days, never missed deadlines. His 5:47 routine got him to the office by 7:30, a full hour early. On October 15th, I made a decision. I set my alarm for 5:45 and got up before Sato-san's usual time. At exactly 5:47, I sat against our shared wall. Sato-san, my name is Yamamoto Takeshi. I live next door. I know you've been trying to get ready for work. I know how important your routine was. I paused, feeling foolish but continuing. It's okay to rest now. Your company knows what happened. Your family took care of your belongings. You don't have to keep getting ready for work. This became my routine. Every morning at 5:47, I sat against the wall talking to Sato-san for 12 minutes, telling him time was passing and he could let go. After 2 weeks, I heard different sounds, lighter footsteps walking normally, continuing for the full time his routine would take. Watanabe-san arranged for a Buddhist monk to perform a ceremony. Tanaka-san was elderly and practical, speaking about restless spirits like plumbing problems. Work-related death creates particular spiritual attachment. Identity becomes so tied to job routine that death cannot break the connection. We help him understand his work is complete. The ceremony was simple. Tanaka-san chanted sutras, burned incense, placed rice and tea offerings. He explained to Sato-san's spirit that his work life was finished, obligations fulfilled, and he was free to move on. I thanked Sato-san for being a considerate neighbor and acknowledged his dedication. I told him I understood what he'd been trying to do, and it was acceptable to let go. The change was gradual. Sounds became less frequent 3 or 4 times weekly instead of daily, a few minutes instead of 12. By December, complete silence returned. Watanabe-san found a new tenant, a university student living there months now without problems. But I still wake naturally, around 5:47 most mornings. Sometimes I think about Sato-san, the pressure that killed him, the importance he placed on never being late. I've changed my routine. I take more time, eat proper breakfast instead of rushing, leave 15 minutes later. I arrive at 8 a.m. instead of 7:30, still early enough to show dedication, but not so early it defines my existence. The building is quiet in mornings now, filled with normal sounds of people beginning days at reasonable hours. But sometimes, sitting with morning coffee at 6 a.m., I listen to silence next door and whisper, "Thanks to Sato-san for teaching me some routines are worth breaking, and rest isn't earned through exhaustion." His alarm clock is gone, donated with his belongings. But every morning at 5:47, I remember its sound, and remember some people work so hard to live, they forget to actually live. That's a lesson worth waking up early for. The study room. My name is Noriko Hayashi, and I teach at a Juku cram school in Kanda. What I'm about to tell you happened during the spring of 2024, and I'm sharing this story because people need to understand what happens when academic pressure becomes unbearable. I moved into my current apartment in March, just before the new school year. It's a small 2-room place on the 2nd floor of an older building, with a 6-tatami main room and a smaller tatami room I use for grading papers and preparing lessons. The rent was reasonable for Kanda, 85,000 yen monthly, which mattered on a cram school teacher's salary. The real estate agent, Kimura-san, mentioned the previous tenant moved out suddenly in February, leaving the apartment in excellent condition. The smaller room had obviously been a study, space marks on walls where shelves had been mounted, tatami ware patterns from a desk and chair in the same position for a long time. I set up my grading desk against the wall facing the small window and arranged my teaching materials on new shelves. For the first few weeks, everything felt normal. I'd come home after long Juku days, eat dinner, then spend hours in the study room grading papers. My students were typical third-year high school students, desperate for prestigious universities, carrying enormous pressure from families and themselves. I had been teaching for 8 years, since graduating from Waseda University myself. I understood the intense stress these students faced, kids who studied until 3 a.m., who had abandoned all social activities for exam preparation, who measured their self-worth entirely by test scores. It was during the 4th week of April that I first noticed something strange. I had been grading practice exams late into the evening, a particularly difficult set of mathematics problems that had challenged even my better students. After finishing around midnight, I left the papers neatly stacked on my desk and went to bed. When I came into the study room the next morning to prepare for work, I found several of the exam papers scattered across the tatami floor. At first, I thought maybe I had knocked them over while getting up during the night, or perhaps the spring breeze through the window had blown them around. But when I gathered the papers to put them back in order, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Someone had been working on them. The papers were covered with additional markings in red ink, not my red ink, which was a standard correction pen, but a different shade of red, applied with what looked like a mechanical pencil. The handwriting was cramped and desperate looking. with numbers and calculations squeezed into every available margin. Most disturbing of all, every single answer had been changed, often multiple times, with previous attempts scribbled out frantically. But these weren't improvements. Every change made the answers worse. Problems that my students had solved correctly were now wrong. Simple calculations had been redone incorrectly. It was as if someone with minimal mathematical ability had been trying desperately to fix problems they couldn't understand, making everything worse with each attempt. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized, and had made the markings myself while half asleep. It sounded ridiculous, but it was the only possibility that made sense. The next evening, I tested this theory. After grading, I carefully arranged fresh practice exams on my desk, photographed their exact position, and noted which papers had which marks. Then I locked the study room door and went to bed. In the morning, the door was still locked, but the papers were scattered again, with even more extensive markings. Red corrections covered nearly every page, with increasingly frantic calculations filling every space. The handwriting was becoming less controlled, more desperate. I compared the papers to my photograph. The markings were definitely new, definitely not mine. That's when I noticed something else that made my hands shake. At the bottom of one page, written in the same cramped red handwriting, were the words, "I have to pass, I have to pass, I have to pass," repeated over and over until they filled the entire margin. I called in sick to work that day and spent the morning researching my apartment building's history online. What I found made everything suddenly horribly clear. In February of 2024, just 1 month before I moved in, a 17-year-old high school student named Tanaka Hiroshi had died by suicide in apartment 204, my apartment. According to news reports, Hiroshi had been a Ronin, a student who had failed his university entrance exams the previous year and was spending a second year studying to retake them. The reports said he had been found in the smaller tatami room, surrounded by practice exams and study materials. His family told reporters that he had been studying 18 hours a day, surviving on energy drinks and convenience store food, rarely leaving the apartment except to attend his cram school. He had failed the entrance exams for his target university 3 times, and the pressure had become unbearable. The news articles mentioned that Hiroshi had been particularly weak in mathematics, despite spending most of his study time on math problems. His cram school teachers described him as hardworking but struggling, someone who would redo the same problems dozens of times but never seemed to improve. His test scores had actually been getting worse in the weeks before his death, despite his increased study hours. Reading this, I understood what had been happening in my study room. Hiroshi was still there, still trying to solve the math problems that had defeated him in life. He was using my students' practice exams to continue his endless, futile study sessions, trying desperately to achieve the passing scores that had remained just beyond his reach. That evening, I decided to try something different. Instead of leaving graded papers on my desk, I prepared a fresh practice exam, one of the easier sets I used for students who were struggling with basic concepts. I wrote a note at the top, "Hiroshi-kun, please try this one. Take your time and don't worry about getting everything perfect." In the morning, I found the paper filled out completely, but still with every answer wrong. However, the handwriting was neater this time, less frantic. At the bottom of the page, in that same cramped script, someone had written, "Thank you, Sensei. I will try harder tomorrow." This began a strange routine that continued for weeks. Every night, I would leave a practice exam for Hiroshi, along with a brief, encouraging note. Every morning, I would find it completed always incorrectly, but with increasing care and organization. His handwriting gradually became more controlled, and the desperate repetitions of "I have to pass" appeared less frequently. I started leaving easier problems, basic arithmetic and simple geometry that any middle school student could handle. Even these came back wrong, but I could see him trying. I began writing detailed explanations of mathematical concepts, breaking down problems step by step, the way I would for my most struggling students. After 3 weeks of this, something changed. I found a note written on the back of one of the practice sheets. Sensei, I don't think I can learn anymore. My head feels so tired. But I can't stop studying. I have to keep trying until I pass. That's when I realized the true horror of Hiroshi's situation. He wasn't just trapped in my apartment, he was trapped in the same cycle of academic failure that had killed him. Every night, he was reliving those final desperate weeks, studying problems he would never be able to solve, taking practice exams he would never be able to pass, caught forever in the moment of his greatest despair. I contacted my grandmother, who had always been more traditional about spiritual matters than my parents. When I explained what was happening, she didn't seem surprised. Some spirits get caught in the actions they were performing when they died, she told me over the phone. If studying was all he knew how to do, if that was his entire identity, then death wouldn't be enough to break the pattern. She arranged for a Buddhist monk from our family temple to visit my apartment. Yamada-sensei was an elderly man who had dealt with similar situations before. He explained that academic pressure could create particularly strong spiritual attachments, especially in young people who had built their entire sense of self around studying and test performance. The boy's identity became completely tied to passing these exams, Yamada-sensei said as he prepared incense and sutra scrolls in the study room. When he failed to achieve this goal, his spirit couldn't accept moving on. He's still trying to complete what he sees as his most important task. The ceremony was conducted on a Saturday morning in late May. Yamada-sensei chanted sutras while burning incense, then spoke directly to Hiroshi's spirit in formal but gentle Japanese. "Tanaka Hiroshi-kun," he said to the empty room, "your student days are complete. You have studied with dedication and effort. Your learning does not end with these tests. There are many ways to gain knowledge and wisdom. It is time to graduate from this classroom and continue your education in the next world." I participated by speaking to Hiroshi directly, thanking him for being such a dedicated student and telling him that his worth wasn't determined by test scores. I explained that learning continues throughout life in many forms, and that he had already shown great perseverance and commitment. After the ceremony, Yamada-sensei left a small protective charm on my desk and advised me to continue leaving encouraging messages for Hiroshi, but to gradually reduce the academic content and instead focus on helping him understand that his identity extended beyond his role as a student. The change was gradual but noticeable. Over the next month, the scattered papers appeared less frequently, and when they did, the red corrections became smaller and less desperate. Instead of frantically reworking every problem, I would find just 1 or 2 attempts at each question, followed by notes like, "This is difficult," or "I tried my best." By the end of June, the supernatural activity had stopped completely. The study room returned to being just a normal workspace where I could grade papers and prepare lessons without finding them mysteriously altered overnight. But the experience changed how I approached teaching. I became more aware of students trapped in desperate study cycles like Hiroshi's. I pay attention to kids who measure their entire self-worth by test scores, who've given up everything for exam preparation. Now, when I see students struggling with problems they can't master, studying 18 hours daily but getting worse results, I remind them their value isn't determined by academic performance. I tell them learning is lifelong. There are many paths to success, and sometimes the most important lesson is knowing when to rest. I still use the study room for work, still help students prepare for entrance exams, but I keep Yamada-sensei's protective charm on my desk, and when working late nights, I pause to pray for students who've pushed themselves too far. The apartment rent remains reasonable, and I've had no problems with the landlord. Sometimes I wonder if I should tell future tenants about Hiroshi, but his spirit has found peace. The study room is quiet now. Every March, when entrance exam results are announced and I see students' joy and devastation, I remember Hiroshi's story. Behind every test score is a young person with hopes and dreams, extending far beyond any single exam. I make sure to tell my students that failing a test doesn't mean failing as a person. Some lessons are more important than entrance exams, and the most crucial thing they can learn is that their worth isn't determined by red marks on practice papers. Hiroshi never learned this in life, but I hope, wherever he is now, he finally understands. I remember that behind every test score is a young person with hopes, fears, and dreams that extend far beyond any single exam. And I make sure to tell my students, as often as necessary, that failing a test doesn't mean failing as a person. Some lessons are more important than anything that appears on an entrance exam, and the most crucial thing they can learn is that their worth isn't determined by red marks on a practice paper. That's something Hiroshi never got the chance to learn in life. But I hope, wherever he is now, he finally understands it. The Convenience Store Run. My name is Sato Kenji, and I'm a 24-year-old part-time worker living in a small apartment above a family mart in Adachi Ward. What I'm about to tell you happened during the summer of 2024, and I'm sharing this story because I think people need to understand what isolation can do to a person, even after death. I moved into apartment 201 in June, right after graduating from a vocational school with a certificate in computer repair. The location was perfect for someone like me, close to several electronic shops where I could find part-time work, and the rent was incredibly affordable at only 60,000 yen per month. The apartment was tiny, just 4.5 tatami mats, but it had everything I needed: a small kitchen area, a unit bath, and a window that faced the alley behind the building. The best part was living directly above the convenience store. As someone who often worked irregular hours and sometimes came home very late, having 24-hour access to food and necessities was incredibly convenient. The store manager, Yoshida-san, was a friendly middle-aged man who didn't mind that I sometimes made purchases at odd hours. The building itself was old but well-maintained, built in the 1970s with that distinctive concrete block construction you see throughout Tokyo's residential areas. There were only 4 apartments total, 2 on the ground floor behind the convenience store, and 2 on the second floor, accessed by an exterior metal staircase that ran along the side of the building. My apartment was at the top of these stairs, while apartment 202 was at the end of a short, outdoor walkway. From my window, I had a clear view of the walkway and could see anyone coming or going from the other second-floor unit. This became important later. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. I established a routine of working at various electronics repair shops during the day, coming home around 7 or 8 p.m., eating dinner, and spending my evenings playing video games or browsing the internet. The building was quiet, with respectful neighbors who kept to themselves. I noticed that apartment 202 seemed to be unoccupied. I never saw anyone entering or leaving, never heard sounds of daily life through the thin walls we shared, and the balcony was completely empty with no laundry hanging or personal items visible. When I asked Yoshida-san about it during one of my late-night convenience store visits, he became evasive. "The previous tenant moved out a few months ago," he said, focusing intently on restocking cigarettes behind the counter. "The landlord is still looking for someone new." Something about his tone suggested there was more to the story, but I didn't push. In Japan, it's not polite to pry into matters that don't directly concern you. It was during my 3rd week in the apartment that I first heard the footsteps. I had stayed up late working on a particularly challenging laptop repair job, trying to troubleshoot a motherboard issue. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I heard the distinctive sound of someone climbing the metal staircase outside. The stairs were old, and each step created a specific metallic clang that echoed off the surrounding buildings. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone was coming home late from work or a night out. But as I listened, I realized the footsteps had stopped directly outside my door. I could hear someone standing there, breathing heavily, as if they had climbed the stairs with great difficulty. Then I heard the sound of keys jingling, and what seemed to be someone trying to fit a key into a lock. But the sounds were coming from my door, not from the direction of apartment 202. I got up quietly and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anyone in the dim lighting of the outdoor walkway. After several minutes of fumbling sounds, the footsteps moved away. Walking along the outdoor corridor toward apartment 202, I heard a door open and close, then silence. In the morning, I checked the area outside my door and found something strange. There was a small convenience store bag sitting on the ground, the kind of plastic bag you get from Family Mart. Inside were 3 items: a cup of instant noodles, a can of coffee, and a package of convenience store rice balls. All of the items were several days past their expiration dates. I brought the bag downstairs to Yoshida-san and asked if he had seen anyone leaving it outside my door. "That's odd," he said, examining the items. "These products are from our store, but we dispose of expired items properly. Someone must have retrieved them from our waste before the collection service came." This pattern continued for several nights. Around 2:30 a.m., I would hear footsteps climbing the metal stairs, followed by someone fumbling with keys at my door. Then the footsteps would continue to apartment 202. In the morning, I would find a convenience store bag containing expired food items. After a week of this, I decided to stay awake and watch through my window to see what was happening. At exactly 2:33 a.m., I saw a figure climbing the stairs, a thin young man wearing pajamas and slippers, moving very slowly, as if each step required tremendous effort. He was carrying a Family Mart bag and appeared to be having difficulty breathing. But here's what made my blood run cold. When he reached the top of the stairs and moved into the light from the outdoor fixture, I could see through him. He was translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass. The figure approached my door, fumbled with keys for several minutes, then continued to apartment 202, where he seemed to pass right through the closed door. I called in sick to work the next day and spent the morning researching the building's history online. What I discovered explained everything in the most horrifying way possible. In March of 2024, just 3 months before I moved in, a 26-year-old man named Nakamura Tomoki had been found dead in apartment 202. According to news reports, Nakamura-san had been a hikikomori, a social recluse who had withdrawn from society completely. He had been living alone in the apartment for over 2 years, rarely leaving his room except for essential trips to the convenience store downstairs. The reports said that Nakamura-san had died of malnutrition and dehydration. His body wasn't discovered for several weeks because he had no regular contact with family or friends. The only reason anyone realized something was wrong was when the convenience store manager noticed that someone who had been a regular late-night customer had suddenly stopped appearing. According to the article, Nakamura-san's routine had been incredibly rigid. Every night at exactly 2:30 a.m., he would leave his apartment, buy the minimum amount of food necessary to survive, usually instant noodles, canned coffee, and rice balls, then return immediately to his room. Yoshida-san told reporters that Nakamura-san never spoke beyond the basic pleasantries required for the transaction and always paid in exact change. The news reports mentioned that in the weeks before his death, Nakamura-san had been purchasing smaller and smaller amounts of food, often buying items that were marked down for quick sale. The store manager had worried about him, but didn't know how to offer help without being intrusive. Reading this, I understood what I had been witnessing. Nakamura-san was still following his nightly routine, still making his desperate trips to the convenience store to buy the minimal food needed for survival. But now he was taking expired items, food that couldn't sustain him, trapped forever in the same cycle that had killed him. That evening, I decided to try something different. Instead of just watching, I prepared my own convenience store bag with fresh food items, good quality instant noodles, hot coffee, rice balls that were well within their expiration dates. At 2:30 a.m., when I heard the footsteps approaching my door, I opened it. The translucent figure of Nakamura-san was standing there, looking confused and exhausted. He was holding keys that didn't fit my lock, trying to enter what he probably thought was his own apartment. When he saw me, he didn't seem surprised, but rather relieved. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that sounded like it came from very far away. "I think I have the wrong keys. I need to buy food before the store closes." I held out the bag of fresh food items. "Nakamura-san, please take this. You don't need to go downstairs tonight." He looked at the bag with desperate gratitude, but when he reached for it, his hands passed right through. The bag fell to the ground, and his expression became one of profound despair. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't touch anything anymore. But I'm so hungry, I have to keep trying to buy food." That's when I realized the true horror of his situation. Nakamura-san was trapped not just in his nightly routine, but in the same state of starvation that had killed him. He was eternally hungry, eternally trying to buy food to survive, but unable to actually consume anything that could help him. I contacted a Buddhist monk the next day, explaining the situation to Tanaka-sensei from a nearby temple. He came to the building that evening and performed a ceremony for Nakamura-san's spirit. "This young man died alone and hungry," Tanaka-sensei explained, as he prepared incense and sutra scrolls in the empty apartment 202, which the landlord had opened for the ceremony. His spirit is still trying to complete the actions he believed would keep him alive. We need to help him understand that his suffering can end. The ceremony was both sad and beautiful. Tanaka-sensei chanted sutras while placing offerings of rice, water, and incense. In the apartment where Nakamura-san had lived and died, he spoke directly to the spirit, explaining that his earthly needs were over, that he no longer needed to worry about buying food or surviving alone. I participated by speaking to Nakamura-san directly, thanking him for being a considerate neighbor and acknowledging how hard it must have been to live in such isolation. I told him that his struggle was over, that he could rest now without worrying about his next meal. After the ceremony, the nightly footsteps stopped. The expired food bags no longer appeared outside my door. Apartment 202 remained silent and empty. But the experience changed me profoundly. I started paying attention to the other late-night customers at the convenience store, especially the ones who came in alone, bought minimal amounts of food, and seemed reluctant to make conversation. I began greeting them more warmly, sometimes mentioning the weather or asking if they needed help finding anything. I also volunteered to help Yoshida-san with community outreach programs, posting information about local support services and mental health resources near the store entrance. We started a small community board where neighbors could post messages, share information, or simply connect with others in the building. The building eventually found a new tenant for apartment 202, a young family with a small child. The apartment has been quiet and peaceful since they moved in, filled with the normal sounds of daily life rather than the desperate silence of isolation. But sometimes, when I come home very late at night and climb those metal stairs, I think about Nakamura-san and the routine that became his prison. I remember that behind every late-night convenience store customer is someone trying to meet their basic needs, someone who might be struggling more than anyone realizes. Living above a 24-hour convenience store has taught me that these places serve as lifelines for people who have nowhere else to go, no one else to depend on. The brief interaction between customer and clerk might be the only human contact some people have for days or weeks at a time. Now, whenever I make my own late-night convenience store runs, I try to be a little friendlier, a little more patient. Because I learned from Nakamura-san that sometimes a simple acknowledgement of someone's existence can be more important than the food they're trying to buy. And every night at 2:33 a.m., when the building is quiet and still, I listen to the silence and feel grateful that it's the peaceful quiet of people resting safely in their homes, not the desperate silence of someone slowly disappearing from the world. The Housekeeping Schedule. My name is Carmen Santos, and I work as a live-in domestic helper for the Watanabe family in their Roppongi apartment. I came to Japan from the Philippines in 2023 on a special visa program, and what I'm about to tell you happened during my first few months working for this family. I need to share this story because I think people should understand the pressure that domestic workers face and what can happen when that pressure becomes too much to bear. The Watanabe family lives in a large apartment on the 15th floor of a luxury building near Tokyo Midtown. Watanabe-san is a senior manager at a trading company, and his wife, Yuki-san, works part-time at a high-end department store. They have 2 children, Takuya-kun, who is 8 years old, and Mika-chan, who is 5. It's a beautiful apartment with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a modern kitchen, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. When I first arrived in Japan, the employment agency explained that I would be replacing the family's previous helper, who had returned to her home country unexpectedly. The agency didn't provide many details, only that the previous helper had been with the Watanabe family for 3 years and had maintained very high standards of housekeeping that I would be expected to continue. My living arrangement was typical for domestic helpers in Japan. I had a small room next to the kitchen, about 6 tatami mats in size, with my own bathroom and a small window facing the service area of the building. The room was clean and functional, with a single bed, a small desk, and a wardrobe for my belongings. Everything I needed to live comfortably while taking care of the family. The Watanabe family was kind to me from the beginning. Watanabe-san spoke excellent English from his business work, and Yuki-san was patient as I learned basic Japanese phrases for household management. The children were well behaved and seemed to understand that I was there to help their family. They showed me respect and followed the house rules without complaint. My responsibilities were extensive, but clearly defined. I was expected to wake up at 5:30 a.m. to prepare breakfast and lunch boxes for the family, clean the apartment thoroughly each day, do laundry twice weekly, prepare dinner 4 nights per week, and manage grocery shopping and other household errands. The family had very specific preferences for how everything should be done, from the way shirts should be folded to the exact temperature the rice should be served. For the first 2 weeks, everything went smoothly. I established my daily routine, learned the family's preferences, and felt confident that I was meeting their expectations. The work was demanding, but not unreasonable for someone with my experience in domestic service. But during my 3rd week, I started noticing something strange. Every Tuesday and Friday, I would put loads of laundry in the washing machine before going to bed around 10 p.m., planning to hang them up to dry first thing in the morning. But when I woke up at 5:30 a.m., I would find all the clothes already washed, dried, folded, and organized exactly as each family member preferred. At first, I thought maybe I had done the laundry the night before and forgotten due to exhaustion. Working as a live-in domestic helper is physically and mentally tiring, and it's easy to lose track of tasks when you're managing so many responsibilities. But when I checked my daily schedule notebook, I clearly had written laundry for the next morning, not the previous evening. The folding was also puzzling because it was done better than I had learned to do it myself. Watanabe-san's business shirts were folded with perfect precision, with no wrinkles and exactly the right crease lines. Yuki-san's delicate blouses were arranged just the way she preferred, with tissue paper between the layers to prevent wrinkles. The children's school uniforms were prepared exactly according to their school's strict requirements. Most disturbing of all, the laundry was organized according to preferences I hadn't learned yet. Takuya-kun's socks were sorted by day of the week in a specific order that I discovered only later when Yuki-san mentioned it casually. Mika-chan's hair ribbons were arranged by color in a pattern that matched her outfit schedule for the following week. I decided to test what was happening by staying awake one Tuesday night to see if I could catch whoever was doing the laundry. I pretended to go to bed at my usual time, but instead sat quietly in my room with the door slightly open so I could hear any movement in the apartment. Around 2 a.m., I heard the washing machine start its cycle, even though I had deliberately left the laundry unwashed. I waited until the cycle finished, then heard the sound of wet clothes being moved, followed by what seemed to be someone working in the utility area where we hung laundry to dry. I got up quietly and crept toward the utility room, but when I looked inside, I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a woman there, hanging up clothes with practiced efficiency, but she was translucent. I could see the wall behind her through her body. She was wearing a simple housekeeping uniform and appeared to be in her 30s, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun. The woman worked with incredible precision and speed, hanging each item of clothing in exactly the right way and in exactly the right order. She seemed to know intuitively how each family member preferred their clothes to be prepared. Her movements were methodical but urgent, as if she was racing against time to complete an impossibly long list of tasks. When she finished hanging the laundry, she moved to other parts of the apartment, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, organizing items that were already organized, and checking details that no one would ever notice. She worked non-stop, moving from room to room with the same urgent precision. I watched in fascination and terror for over an hour before she finally faded away completely, leaving behind perfectly organized laundry and an apartment that was somehow even cleaner than when she had started. The next morning, I asked Yuki-san casually about the previous domestic helper, trying to learn more without revealing what I had witnessed. "Ah, Rosa-san," Yuki-san said with a sad expression. "She was wonderful, very dedicated to her work. She came to us from the Philippines, like you. But the pandemic was very difficult for everyone, and she worked so hard to keep our family safe and healthy." "What happened to her?" I asked gently. "She became sick during the worst part of the pandemic in 2021. She was working very long hours, disinfecting everything constantly, managing all our shopping and errands because we were afraid to go out. She never took breaks, never complained, always said the family's safety was most important." Yuki-san paused, looking uncomfortable. Rosa-san collapsed one morning while preparing breakfast. The doctor said it was exhaustion and overwork. Her heart just gave out from the stress and lack of rest. She was only 32 years old. I felt a chill of recognition. The woman I had seen doing laundry looked exactly like someone who had died of exhaustion, thin, pale, but still driven to continue working. "She died here in the apartment?" I asked. "Yes, right there in the kitchen while making our morning meal. We were all devastated. Rosa-san was like family to us, and we felt terrible that we hadn't realized how much strain she was under. That evening, I decided to try communicating with Rosa-san's spirit directly. When I heard the washing machine start at 2 a.m., I got up and went to the utility room, but this time I spoke to her. "Rosa-san," I said quietly in English, then repeated in my limited Japanese. "I am Carmen. I work for the Watanabe family now." The translucent figure paused in her laundry hanging and looked at me with tired, kind eyes. She didn't seem surprised to see me, but rather relieved that someone could acknowledge her presence. "The work," she said in accented Japanese, "must be finished perfectly. The family depends on us. Rosa-san, you can rest now. I am here to take care of the family. Your work is complete." But she shook her head sadly. "There is always more work. The schedule must be maintained. If I rest, who will make sure everything is perfect for the family?" I realized that Rosa-san was trapped in the same cycle of overwork that had killed her. Even in death, she couldn't allow herself to rest, because she felt the family's needs were more important than her own well-being. Over the following weeks, I tried different approaches to help Rosa-san find peace. I would complete tasks before she felt the need to do them, hoping to show her that the work was being handled properly. I would leave notes in Tagalog and Japanese, explaining that the family was safe and well cared for. But Rosa-san continued her nightly routine, working tirelessly on tasks that didn't need to be done, maintaining standards that were beyond what any living person could sustain. Finally, I decided to speak with Watanabe-san and Yuki-san directly about what I was experiencing. I was nervous about how they would react, but I felt they needed to understand what was happening in their home. When I explained about Rosa-san's spirit still working in the apartment, both of them became very quiet and thoughtful. We suspected something like this might be happening, Watanabe-san admitted. Sometimes we would find tasks completed that we didn't remember asking anyone to do. Items would be organized in ways that only Rosa-san used to do. Yuki-san nodded. We felt guilty about Rosa-san's death. She worked so hard for our family, but we didn't realize the toll it was taking on her health. We should have insisted that she rest more, take proper breaks. Together, we arranged for a Buddhist monk to come to the apartment and perform a ceremony for Rosa-san's spirit. The monk, Sasaki-sensei, explained that domestic workers who die from overwork often become trapped in their service routines because their sense of duty is so strong. This woman's spirit cannot rest because she believes her work is unfinished, Sasaki-sensei said, as he prepared incense and sutras in our kitchen. We must help her understand that her service was complete and appreciated, and that she has permission to rest. The ceremony was conducted on a Tuesday evening, the day when Rosa-san's activity was always strongest. Sasaki-sensei chanted sutras while the entire Watanabe family participated, thanking Rosa-san for her dedicated service and explicitly giving her permission to rest. Watanabe-san spoke directly to Rosa-san's spirit, apologizing for not recognizing the signs of her exhaustion and promising to be more mindful of their future domestic helpers' well-being. Yuki-san thanked her for the love and care she had shown their family, and both children drew pictures showing Rosa-san resting peacefully. I spoke to Rosa-san in Tagalog, telling her that her work had been more than sufficient, that she had exceeded every expectation, and that it was time for her to rest and be at peace. After the ceremony, the supernatural activity gradually decreased. I still occasionally found tasks completed that I hadn't done myself, but less frequently and with less urgency. It seemed that Rosa-san was slowly learning to let go of her compulsive need to work. But the experience changed how I approach my own work as a domestic helper. I learned that it's important to maintain boundaries, to take proper rest, and to communicate clearly with my employers about what is reasonable to expect. I also worked with the Watanabe family to establish better practices for household management. We created realistic schedules that include proper break times, discussed the importance of work-life balance, and established clear communication about expectations and limitations. The family has been very supportive of these changes. They realize now that expecting perfection at the cost of someone's health is neither sustainable nor ethical. They encourage me to take my scheduled days off, to rest when I'm sick, and to speak up if the workload becomes overwhelming. I still live in the same room where Rosa-san once lived, and sometimes I think about her dedication to the family and her inability to put her own needs first. I try to honor her memory by doing excellent work for the Watanabe family, but also by taking care of my own health and well-being. Every Tuesday and Friday, when I do the laundry, I say a small prayer for Rosa-san and all the domestic workers around the world who sacrifice their own well-being to care for others. I hope that wherever she is now, Rosa-san has finally found the rest she was never able to give herself in life. And I've learned that being a good domestic helper doesn't mean working yourself to death. It means providing reliable, caring service while maintaining your own dignity and health. That's a lesson Rosa-san never got the chance to learn, but one that I carry with me every day in her memory. The late-night cooking. Concept summary. A university student in a converted shared apartment discovers that the ghost of a father who died by suicide continues preparing elaborate family meals in the communal kitchen. Cooking for 4 people who no longer live there after his death forced his family to move away and the apartment to be divided into student housing. My name is Yuta Kobayashi, and I'm a second-year computer science student at Tokyo University of Science. What I'm about to tell you happened during my time living in a shared apartment in Akihabara. And I'm sharing this story because I think people need to understand how economic pressure can drive families to desperation and how that desperation can linger even after death. I moved into the shared apartment in April of 2024, at the start of my second year. Finding affordable housing near campus is incredibly difficult in Tokyo, especially for students like me, whose families can only provide minimal financial support. My parents run a small farm in Gunma Prefecture, and while they work hard, there's barely enough money to cover my tuition, let alone expensive Tokyo rent. The apartment was in a converted residential building, about 15 minutes by bicycle from campus. What had once been a traditional family apartment had been divided into 4 small rental rooms, sharing a communal kitchen, bathroom, and small living area. My room was tiny, just 4.5 tatami mats, but it was clean, and the rent was only 55,000 yen per month, which was about 20,000 less than anything else I had found in the area. The other 3 tenants were also university students. There was Kenji-kun, studying economics at Waseda, Daisuke-kun from Meiji University's engineering program, and Satoshi-kun, who was a year older and studying literature at Rikyo. We all kept to ourselves mostly, sharing the common spaces politely but maintaining the typical Japanese approach of not getting too involved in each other's personal lives. The communal kitchen was reasonably well equipped for a shared living situation. It had a 2-burner gas stove, a small refrigerator that we divided into sections with masking tape and name labels, basic cookware, and enough counter space for simple meal preparation. Each of us had our own shelf in the cupboards, and our own section of refrigerator space marked clearly to avoid any conflicts. For the first month, our living arrangement worked smoothly. We each cooked simple meals, mostly rice, miso soup, and basic dishes that didn't require much time or elaborate preparation. Occasionally, someone would make extra and offer to share, but generally we maintained our independence and respected each other's schedules and space. It was during the second week of May that I first noticed something unusual about the kitchen. I had been staying up late working on a programming assignment and decided to get a drink of water around 2 a.m. When I entered the kitchen, I was surprised to find it filled with the aroma of cooking, not just any cooking, but the complex, layered scents of traditional Japanese dishes that take hours to prepare properly. On the counter and stove were several dishes that hadn't been there when I went to bed around midnight. Perfectly prepared chicken teriyaki with a glossy caramelized sauce, delicate tamagoyaki rolled with expert precision, miso soup with handmade tofu, and beautifully arranged vegetables that looked like they belonged in a high-end restaurant. The rice cooker was steaming with perfectly prepared rice, and there were even side dishes of pickled vegetables and seasoned spinach. But what struck me most was that everything was portioned for exactly 4 people. Not the kind of single portions we usually made for ourselves, but family-sized servings carefully divided into 4 equal parts, each arranged on separate plates, as if waiting for a family to sit down together for a meal. I assumed one of my roommates had been cooking for visiting family or friends and had simply finished later than expected. The food smelled incredible, and the presentation was far better than anything any of us had ever made in that kitchen. I took my water and returned to my room, thinking I would ask about it in the morning. But when I woke up around 8 a.m., the kitchen was completely clean. All the dishes had been washed and put away, and there was no sign that anyone had done any cooking the night before. When I asked my roommates about it, they all looked confused. I went to bed around 11 and didn't cook anything, Kenji-kun said. Same here, agreed Daisuke-kun. I just made instant ramen around 10 p.m., but nothing elaborate. Satoshi-kun, who was usually the most active cook among us, shook his head. I was at the library until midnight. I didn't even come into the kitchen last night. I decided I must have been more tired than I realized, and perhaps dreamed the whole thing. College life is exhausting, and it's not uncommon for students to experience hallucinations from sleep deprivation and stress. But 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was deliberately staying alert to work on a particularly challenging coding project. Around 2:30 a.m., I started smelling that same complex aroma of traditional cooking. I got up immediately and went to the kitchen, where I found an even more elaborate spread than before. Someone had prepared what looked like a complete family dinner. Grilled fish with a perfectly crispy skin and moist interior. Several types of vegetables prepared in different styles. Homemade gyoza that looked like they had been folded by an expert. And a large pot of nabemono hot pot that was still simmering on the stove. Again, everything was portioned for exactly 4 people, with each serving carefully arranged as if waiting for family members to arrive. But the kitchen was empty. I could hear the quiet sounds of my roommates sleeping in their rooms, and there was no one visible preparing the food. Yet the stove was on, the food was hot and fresh, and I could see steam rising from the dishes. I turned off the stove burners for safety and retreated to my room, feeling deeply unsettled. In the morning, once again, everything had been cleaned up completely, with no trace of the elaborate cooking. This pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every few nights, around the same time, I would smell traditional cooking and find elaborate family meals prepared in the kitchen, always portioned for 4 people, always with the kind of care and attention that spoke of someone who really loved the people they were cooking for. Finally, I decided to research the history of our apartment building. What I discovered made everything suddenly, terribly clear. According to records from the ward office, our apartment had originally been a family residence until 2 years ago. A man named Ishikawa Masaki had lived there with his wife and 2 teenage children, a family of 4. Ishikawa-san had been employed as a middle manager at a manufacturing company, but had lost his job during the economic difficulties of 2022, when many companies downsized due to ongoing pandemic effects. The record showed that Ishikawa-san had struggled to find new employment for over a year, falling behind on rent and other expenses, despite his wife taking a part-time job and both children working after-school jobs to help with family finances. The stress of unemployment and financial pressure had taken a severe toll on his mental health. According to a news report I found online, Ishikawa-san had died by suicide in the apartment in January of 2023. The article mentioned that he had been found in the kitchen early in the morning, and that neighbors reported he had been staying up very late every night, apparently cooking elaborate meals for his family, even though they could barely afford groceries. After Ishikawa-san's death, his wife and children had been forced to move out due to financial difficulties and the stigma associated with the suicide. The landlord had then renovated the apartment, dividing it into smaller units to rent to students who would be less concerned about the property's tragic history and more motivated by the below-market rent prices. But Ishikawa-san, it seemed, was still there in the kitchen, still trying to provide for his family by preparing the kind of elaborate, loving meals he had made for them when they were struggling financially. He was continuing his role as the family provider, even though his family was no longer there to receive his care. That night, I decided to try communicating with Ishikawa-san directly. When I smelled the cooking starting around 2 a.m., I went into the kitchen and spoke to the empty room. Ishikawa-san, I said respectfully, using the proper honorific. I am Yuta Kobayashi. I live here now with my friends. We are grateful for the meals you have prepared, but your family is safe now. You don't need to keep cooking for them. The cooking sounds paused for a moment, and I felt a presence in the room, not threatening, but profoundly sad and exhausted. They need to eat, a voice whispered from somewhere near the stove. I have to make sure they have enough food. times are difficult and they depend on me. Ishikawa-san, your family has moved to a new home where they can take care of themselves. Your job as their provider is complete. You can rest now. But the cooking sounds resumed, more urgently than before. I realized that Ishikawa-san was trapped in the same cycle of anxiety about providing for his family that had consumed him in life. Even death hadn't freed him from the pressure he felt to be a good father and husband. Over the following weeks, I tried different approaches to help him understand that his family was no longer there. I would leave notes explaining that the apartment was now student housing, that his wife and children had moved on and were managing on their own. Sometimes I would eat small portions of the food he prepared, hoping to show him that his cooking was appreciated even if it wasn't needed by his original family. Gradually, my roommates began to notice the situation as well. Daisuke-kun admitted he had sometimes smelled cooking late at night, and Satoshi-kun mentioned finding the kitchen mysteriously clean in the mornings after he had left it messy. When I explained what I had discovered about Ishikawa-san, they were all understanding and supportive. My father works very hard to provide for our family too, Kenji-kun said quietly. I can understand how that kind of pressure might not end even with death. We decided together to contact a Buddhist monk who could perform a proper ceremony for Ishikawa-san's spirit. Tanaka-sensei from a nearby temple came to our apartment on a Saturday evening and conducted a memorial service in the kitchen where Ishikawa-san had died. This man's spirit is bound by his sense of duty to his family, Tanaka-sensei explained as he prepared incense and sutra scrolls. He cannot rest because he believes his work as a provider is unfinished. We must help him understand that his love for his family was complete and that they are capable of caring for themselves now. During the ceremony, each of us spoke to Ishikawa-san directly, thanking him for his dedication to his family and acknowledging the pressure he must have felt as their provider. We told him that his love had been enough, that his family remembered him fondly, and that it was time for him to rest. Tanaka-sensei chanted sutras while we offered rice, tea, and incense, explaining to Ishikawa-san's spirit that his earthly responsibilities were complete and that he was free to move on to whatever comes after life. After the ceremony, the late-night cooking gradually became less frequent and less elaborate. Instead of full family meals, I might occasionally find just a single portion of rice or a simple soup, as if Ishikawa-san was slowly learning to let go of his compulsive need to provide for 4 people. By the end of the semester, the supernatural cooking had stopped completely. Though sometimes the kitchen still carries a faint aroma of traditional cooking that reminds me of Ishikawa-san's dedication to his family. The experience changed how I think about the pressure that Japanese fathers face to provide for their families, especially during economic difficulties. I realized that the same economic pressures that made our apartment affordable for students had once destroyed a family, and that the weight of being a provider can become so heavy that it continues even after death. I also gained a deeper appreciation for the elaborate meals my own parents prepare when I visit home. I understand now that cooking for family is more than just providing nutrition. It's a way of showing love, care, and commitment to the people who depend on you. Sometimes, when I'm cooking simple meals for myself in that same kitchen, I think about Ishikawa-san and the love he put into every dish he prepared for his family. I try to cook with the same care and attention even for my own simple student meals, as a way of honoring his memory and the dedication he showed as a father. And when my own father calls to check on my finances and make sure I'm eating properly, I'm more patient with his concerns, understanding now that a father's worry about providing for his children can be both a blessing and a burden that extends far beyond what anyone might expect. The apartment rent remains affordable, and none of us have ever regretted living there. But we've all learned to appreciate the difference between a house and a home, and to understand that some kinds of love and responsibility can echo in a place long after the people who created them have moved on. The grandmother's visits. Concept summary. 8-year-old Kenji discovers that the elderly woman visiting his bedroom each night to help with homework and teach manners is the apartment's previous tenant who died alone, seeking the grandchild relationship she never had in life. My name is Kenji, and I'm 8 years old. I live with my mama and papa in a small apartment in Asakusa, near the old temple where tourists come to take pictures. Our apartment is on the 3rd floor, and from my bedroom window, I can see the red lanterns hanging outside the shops below. I want to tell you about Oba-chan, the kind grandmother who comes to visit me every night. But first, I should explain why we moved here. Papa works very hard at the electronics company, but Mama says money is tight since the company had to lay off some workers. When our old landlord raised the rent last spring, Papa's face got very serious, and he and Mama had long whispers in the kitchen after they thought I was asleep. That's when Mama started looking at apartment listings every morning with her coffee. "This one's perfect," Mama said one day, showing Papa a paper. 2 bedrooms, close to Kenji's school, and look at this rent price." Papa frowned at the numbers. "Why is it so cheap? There must be something wrong with it." The real estate agent, Tanaka-san, was very polite when we visited the apartment. He explained everything carefully while Mama and Papa looked around. The apartment was clean and bright, with tatami mats in the bedrooms and a small balcony facing east for morning Sunday. "The previous tenant lived here for 43 years, Tanaka-san said, adjusting his glasses. "She was 91 when she passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years ago. As required by law, I must inform you that this qualifies as a Jiko-buken property. The reduced rent reflects this circumstance." Papa nodded seriously. Mama asked about the old lady's family. "Sadly, she had no visitors in her final years," Tanaka-san said quietly. "Her grandson lived in Osaka and couldn't visit often due to work obligations. She was found by the building superintendent when neighbors noticed her newspapers accumulating." After Tanaka-san left, Mama and Papa talked in low voices while I explored my new bedroom. It was perfect, bigger than my old one, with built-in shelves for my books and models. The morning sun made everything warm and golden. "It's just an old person who died naturally," Mama whispered to Papa. "Not like those other cases. And Kenji needs stability for school." Papa sighed. "The price is right, and it's clean, if you're comfortable with it." We moved in 3 weeks later. Everything was normal for the first month. I liked my new room, especially the way the morning light came through the shoji screen. Mama set up my desk near the window where I could do homework and look out at the street below. Then Oba-chan started visiting. The first time was on a Tuesday night in October. I had fallen asleep over my kanji practice sheets, my pencil still in my hand. I woke up when I felt someone gently shaking my shoulder. "Kenji-kun, you shouldn't sleep at your desk. You'll hurt your neck." I opened my eyes to see an elderly woman kneeling beside my chair. She wore a simple gray kimono and had her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was kind, with gentle wrinkles around her eyes. "Who are you, Oba-chan?" I asked, not afraid at all. She reminded me of my great-grandmother who used to visit when I was very small. "I'm just someone who cares about proper study habits," she said with a warm smile. "Let's get you to bed properly, and tomorrow we'll work on your kanji together." She helped me to my futon and tucked the blanket around me with practiced movements. "Sleep well, Kenji-kun." When I woke up in the morning, I thought it might have been a dream, except my homework was neatly stacked on my desk instead of scattered where I'd left it. The next night, she came again. This time, I was awake, struggling with a particularly difficult kanji for gratitude. "May I help you with that?" she asked, appearing silently beside my desk. "Yes, please, Oba-chan. I can't get the stroke order right." She knelt beside me and took my hand in hers. Her skin was cool but gentle. "Like this, Kenji-kun. This character means to be thankful for what others do for you. Each stroke has meaning." She guided my hand through the proper movements, her voice soft and patient. "Your parents work very hard to give you a good home. Always remember to be grateful. I will, Oba-chan. She smiled and patted my head. Good boy. Now, shall we practice your proper greetings? A well-mannered child brings honor to his family. For the next hour, she taught me the correct way to bow, how to speak politely to adults, and the importance of helping with household chores without being asked. Everything she said made perfect sense. This became our nightly routine. After Mama and Papa went to sleep, Oba-chan would come to my room. Sometimes she helped with homework, sometimes she taught me proper manners, and sometimes she just told me stories about old Tokyo, back when she was young. I lived in this apartment for a very long time. She told me one night. I watched the neighborhood change, saw children grow up and move away. But you're the first child to live here with me. Do you live here too, Oba-chan? She was quiet for a moment. In a way, yes. This has been my home for so long. I find it difficult to leave. I didn't think this was strange. Sometimes old people had trouble moving to new places. My grades improved dramatically. My teacher, Suzuki-sensei, praised my homework and my improved classroom manners. At home, Mama and Papa were surprised when I started helping with dishes without being asked and bowing properly when Papa came home from work. Where did you learn such beautiful penmanship? Mama asked one morning, looking at my homework. Oba-chan taught me, I said proudly. Mama smiled. What Oba-chan, Kenji? Your great-grandmother lives in Kyoto. The Oba-chan who lives here with us. Papa looked up from his newspaper. Kenji, there's no grandmother living with us. But she comes to my room every night to help with homework and teach me manners. Mama and Papa exchanged that look adults get when they think children are being imaginative. That's a nice story, Kenji, Mama said gently. But you're doing your homework all by yourself. We're very proud of how hard you're working. I wanted to explain, but I could tell they wouldn't believe me. The situation changed 2 weeks later when Mama found my completed homework on the kitchen table one morning. I had fallen asleep before finishing it, but somehow every problem was solved. Every kanji written perfectly. Kenji, Mama called me from the kitchen. Did you finish your homework after we went to bed? No, Mama. I fell asleep. Oba-chan must have finished it for me. Mama studied the papers closely. The handwriting was definitely not mine. The characters were formed with old-fashioned brushstrokes, each one precise and beautiful in a way that took decades to master. Show me how you write this character, Mama said, pointing to a particularly complex kanji. I tried to copy it, but my version looked clumsy compared to the one on the homework. That night, Mama and Papa stayed awake late, talking in worried whispers. I heard them mention words like stress and overactive imagination, but I was too sleepy to pay attention. The next evening, Papa decided to check on me after bedtime. He opened my door quietly and found me sitting at my desk with Oba-chan, working on math problems. But Papa only saw me sitting alone, talking to empty air. Kenji, Papa said softly, who are you talking to? I looked at Oba-chan, who nodded encouragingly. Oba-chan is helping me with division. Papa came into the room and knelt beside my desk. Kenji, there's no one here but you. She's right there, Papa. I pointed to Oba-chan, who was still sitting beside me, looking sad. Papa's face went pale. He picked me up and carried me to the living room where Mama was waiting. We need to talk to someone about this, Papa whispered to Mama. The next day, Mama took me to see a child psychologist, Dr. Yamamoto. She was very nice and asked lots of questions about my imaginary friend. Children often create companions when they're adjusting to new situations. Doctor, Yamamoto explained to Mama, moving to a new apartment, starting a new school year. These can trigger the need for additional comfort and support. But that night, when Oba-chan came to visit, I told her what the doctor had said. Oba-chan's expression grew thoughtful. I see. They're worried about you. Are you really just in my imagination, Oba-chan? She smiled sadly. What do you think, Kenji-kun? I looked at my homework, perfectly completed in handwriting I could never manage. I thought about all the things she had taught me, the way she tucked me into bed, the stories about old Tokyo that I couldn't have known. I think you're real, I said. Then that's what matters, she said softly. The situation came to a head the following week, when Mama decided to research the apartment's history more thoroughly. She visited the building superintendent, Ogawa-san, who had worked there for 20 years. Ah, you're asking about Matsumoto-san, Ogawa-san said, when Mama mentioned the previous tenant. Such a sad case. She lived here since 1980, raised her son after her husband died young. But her son moved to Osaka for work, and over the years, his visits became less frequent. Did she have grandchildren? Mama asked. Ogawa-san nodded sadly. One grandson, but he never visited. She used to show me his school photos, talked about him constantly. Toward the end, she would sometimes speak to him as if he were there, especially at night. We could hear her through the walls, teaching someone proper manners, helping with homework. The neighbors heard her talking? Oh yes, for years. We thought perhaps she had started keeping a small television on for company, but when we found her, Ogawa-san paused respectfully. Her last words, according to the paramedics, were about waiting for her grandson to visit. That evening, Mama and Papa had a long discussion after they thought I was asleep. I heard them talking about consulting a Buddhist priest, about whether we should move again, about what was best for me. When Oba-chan came that night, I could tell something had changed. She seemed fainter somehow, less solid than before. Oba-chan, are you okay? Your parents are very worried about you, Kenji-kun. Good parents protect their children, even from things they don't understand. But I don't want you to go away. You help me with homework, and you teach me good manners, and you tell the best stories. Her eyes filled with tears. And you listen so carefully, just like a real grandson should. You never interrupt. You always say thank you, and you work so hard on your studies. Because you taught me to. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her kimono. I never had the chance to teach anyone these things. My grandson was always too busy, too far away. But you gave me the chance to be the Oba-chan I always wanted to be. Then why do you look sad? Because continuing to visit might cause problems for your family. Your parents love you very much, and they're frightened by something they can't see or understand. I thought about this carefully. What if we found a way for them to not worry, but you could still visit sometimes? Oba-chan's face brightened slightly. What do you mean? Well, maybe you don't have to help with homework where they might find it, and maybe you could visit just to say goodnight and tell stories. That wouldn't scare them, would it? She smiled, and for a moment she looked almost solid again. You're a very wise boy, Kenji-kun. Yes, I think that might work. From that night on, our arrangement changed. Oba-chan still visited, but she no longer completed my homework or left obvious signs of her presence. Instead, she would come just before I fell asleep, tuck me in properly, and whisper stories about old Tokyo, or gentle advice about being a good son. My grades remained excellent because she had already taught me good study habits. My manners stayed proper because she had shown me the importance of respect and gratitude. But now these improvements seemed to come naturally from me, not from mysterious outside help. Mama and Papa relaxed as the supernatural incident stopped. They praised my continued good behavior and academic improvement, attributing it to my adjustment to the new home. I'm so proud of how mature you've become, Mama said one evening after I had cleared the dinner dishes without being asked. Thank you, Mama. I learned it from someone very wise. Oh, who taught you that? I smiled. Just someone who cares about proper manners. That night, I told Oba-chan what Mama had said. She's right to be proud, Oba-chan said, smoothing my blanket. You've become such a fine boy. Your parents are lucky to have you. And I'm lucky to have you visit, Oba-chan. She kissed my forehead gently. Sweet dreams, Kenji-kun. Remember to always be grateful for your family. I will. Will you tell me another story? about the old days? Of course. Once, when I was about your age, this neighborhood was very different. As she spoke, I drifted off to sleep, feeling safe and loved. In the morning, I would wake up with my blanket perfectly tucked around me, and a warm feeling in my heart, ready to be the best son I could be. Sometimes Mama or Papa would ask about my imaginary friend, and I would smile and say that I didn't need to imagine anything I had, everything I needed right here with my family. And that was true, because even though they couldn't see her, Oba-chan had taught me the most important lesson of all, that love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just finds new ways to express itself. Like an elderly woman who never got to be a grandmother finding a little boy who needed one. Both of them learning what family really means. Late at night, when I'm almost asleep, I still hear her soft voice whispering, "Good night, Kenji-kun. Be grateful for each day, and always honor your parents." And I always whisper back, "Good night, Oba-chan. Thank you for everything." Some gifts are too precious to explain to adults. They just have to be treasured quietly, in the space between sleeping and waking, where love lives on in the gentlest possible way. The cooking lessons. Concept summary. After moving to a smaller apartment following his wife's death, widower Ichiro-san discovers that the previous tenant, a young chef who died from overwork, is still teaching cooking through his clumsy hands, sharing the culinary knowledge she never got to pass on to her own family. My name is Ichiro, and I am 73 years old. Until last year, I had never cooked a proper meal in my life. My wife Sachiko handled all the cooking during our 47 years of marriage. When she passed from cancer in March of 2024, I survived on convenience store bento for months before realizing this wasn't sustainable. The house in Nerima felt enormous without her. My daughter Yuki suggested I move somewhere smaller. "Papa, you need a fresh start," she said. The practical considerations were overwhelming: mortgage payments, maintenance, the simple fact that I was rattling around in 4 rooms when I barely used 2. We found a 1-bedroom apartment in Sumida, near the Skytree. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the real estate agent, Kimura-san, explained why during our viewing. "I must inform you, this is a Jikobuken property," he said formally. "The previous tenant passed away here 18 months ago. Overwork-related death. A 28-year-old chef who worked at a restaurant in Ginza. She collapsed from exhaustion, working 18-hour days, trying to save money to bring her elderly parents from Hiroshima to Tokyo. The kitchen was small, but well organized, with professional equipment that looked expensive. The cooking items are included," Kimura-san continued. "Her family couldn't bear to take them. I felt something peaceful about the space, rather than tragic. 'I'll take it,' I said. Moving in was simple. At my age, you realize how little you actually need. The apartment felt comfortable immediately, especially the kitchen. Everything was arranged with professional efficiency. Knives on magnetic strips, spices alphabetically organized, utensils within easy reach of the stove. My first cooking attempt was disaster. I tried making miso soup, but oversalted it catastrophically while undercooking the tofu. I went to bed discouraged, having eaten convenience store rice balls instead. I woke around 3 in the morning to gentle sounds from the kitchen. At first I thought a neighbor was cooking, but the sounds came from my own kitchen. Peering around the corner, everything looked normal, but my failed soup experiment had been cleaned up. The scattered ingredients were now organized in neat groups. Miso paste next to measured dashi powder, tofu cut into perfect cubes, green onions finely chopped. I checked the door locked and chained. The windows were secure. No one could have entered. Standing in the quiet kitchen, I noticed a faint smell of properly prepared miso soup, rich and savory, completely different from my bitter disaster. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. But that evening, attempting to make rice, I found a small paper with instructions in neat, feminine handwriting. Rinse rice 3 times until water runs clear. Use 1-to-1 ratio. Cook 18 minutes, then rest 20 minutes. I followed the instructions exactly and made perfect rice for the first time in my life. This pattern continued for weeks. Each evening I'd struggle with basic cooking. Each morning I'd find helpful adjustments and instruction cards in that same careful handwriting. The cards taught fundamental skills: proper knife grips, how to tell when oil is ready, the difference between simmering and boiling. Cut vegetables uniformly for even cooking, one instructed. Season in layers, not all at once. My cooking improved dramatically. Within a month, I was eating proper home-cooked meals instead of convenience store food. One evening, while practicing knife skills, I spoke to the empty kitchen. "Thank you for the lessons. I hope you don't mind such an old student." The next morning's card read, "Practice makes perfect. Keep trying, Ichiro-san." She knew my name. As autumn deepened, lessons became more advanced. I learned to make proper dashi from scratch, prepare tempura vegetables, balance teriyaki sauce. Sometimes I'd find ingredients I hadn't purchased: fresh ginger, quality soy sauce. When I checked my wallet, exact amounts were missing. Cooking aromas began appearing more frequently. I'd wake to rich soup stock or fresh baked rice bread smells. The kitchen always looked untouched, but the aromas lingered. One November night, I decided to stay awake and observe. Around 2:30, I saw her clearly for the first time. A young woman moved efficiently around the kitchen, wearing chef's whites with her black hair in a neat bun. She seemed translucent, like a reflection on water. Her movements had the fluid economy of professional experience. Every gesture purposeful, no motion wasted. She looked directly at where I was hiding and nodded politely, acknowledgement between teacher and student. Then she returned to her preparations. The next morning brought the most elaborate lesson yet: chicken katsu instructions with a personal note. This was my specialty at the restaurant. I hope you enjoy learning it, Ichiro-san. From then on, our arrangement was openly acknowledged. I'd leave written questions, and she'd respond with detailed explanations, revealing deep professional knowledge. Her answers showed someone who truly loved cooking as both craft and caring. "Cooking is an act of love," one note explained. "Food prepared with care nourishes more than just the body." I understood why she remained. She died with knowledge left to share, techniques she'd never passed on to family. But now, she had found a student. My daughter Yuki noticed changes when she visited in December. "Papa, this gyoza is incredible. Where did you learn to cook like this?" "I've been taking lessons from someone very dedicated to proper technique," I said truthfully. Winter deepened, and my skills improved remarkably. I learned complex dishes, proper ramen with 12-hour broth, delicate tempura, restaurant-quality sushi rice. But I also noticed akemi appearing more solid, less translucent. One snowy evening, struggling with julienning vegetables, she appeared beside me. "Like this, Ichiro-san," she said softly, hands guiding mine. "Consistent size is more important than speed." Her touch was cool but gentle. "What's your name?" I asked. "Akemi Tanaka. I worked at Kiku in Ginza for 6 years." "That's prestigious." "Yes, but I worked too hard, wanting to save money for my parents. I never got the chance to cook for them." Her expression was sad. "You're teaching me now. That's family too." She smiled genuinely for the first time. "I never expected a student like you, someone patient enough to learn properly." Spring arrived, and I realized I'd become genuinely skilled. Cooking had become my meditation, creative outlet, connection to past and present. Akemi's appearances became less frequent as I needed less guidance. "You don't need me as much anymore," she said one April evening, watching me prepare kaiseki-style dishes for Yuki's birthday. "You'll always be welcome in this kitchen." She smiled sadly, already fading. "You've given me the chance to be the teacher I wanted to become." My parents would be proud, seeing their daughter's skills living on. Will you visit sometimes? When you cook with techniques I taught you, I'm always here. Every properly cut vegetable, every balanced sauce, that's my knowledge continuing. That was the last time I saw Akemi clearly. But her presence remains subtly. Sometimes I wake to dashi aromas. Occasionally, ingredients are arranged differently than I left them. When I teach cooking classes at the community center now, sharing her techniques with other elderly people, I feel her satisfaction. Her knowledge flows through my hands to nourish others, exactly as she intended. The other day, helping a struggling student with miso soup, I heard Akemi's voice. Patience is the most important ingredient. I'm 74 now, cooking every day, not from necessity, but love. Each meal is conversation, with tradition, with teachers before me, with people I feed. Late at night, cleaning after dinner parties, I speak to the empty kitchen. Thank you, Akemi-san. Your lessons live on. Sometimes I hear a soft reply. Keep cooking, Ichiro-san. Keep sharing what you've learned. The kitchen feels warm, with more than stove heat, filled with accumulated wisdom of a young chef who died too soon, and an old student who found purpose in unexpected places. We both got what we needed. She found someone to teach. I found reason to keep living fully. That's what the best cooking really does, connects us across time and circumstance, nourishing far more than just our bodies. The Internet Connection. My name is Haruka Sato, and I'm 24 years old. I work part-time at a convenience store in Adachi while studying for my certification exams, barely scraping together enough money to survive in Tokyo. When I found the apartment, I thought I'd finally caught a break. The building was converted from an old internet cafe in 2022, when the owner decided budget housing would be more profitable than 24-hour computer rentals. The individual units were tiny. Basically, the old internet booths expanded slightly to include a narrow sleeping area and shared bathrooms on each floor. But at 30,000 yen per month, it was the cheapest thing I could find within commuting distance of my job. Previous tenants left some furniture. The landlord, Ogawa-san, mentioned when showing me Unit 207. You're welcome to use whatever's useful and dispose of the rest. The space was cramped but clean. A small desk sat against one wall with an older computer monitor, still mounted on an adjustable arm. Basic furniture filled the narrow room. A single futon, small dresser, mini fridge. Everything looked worn but functional. What about internet? I asked, knowing I couldn't afford a separate connection on top of rent and utilities. Ogawa-san shrugged. The building has wireless from the old cafe days, but it's spotty. You'd probably need your own plan for reliable service. I signed the lease anyway, figuring I could use free Wi-Fi at convenience stores and the library when necessary. Moving in was simple. I owned almost nothing anyway. The previous tenant had left behind practical items, bedding, some dishes, even a laptop computer that still worked despite being several years old. Finding usable electronics felt like winning the lottery, given my financial situation. That first evening, exhausted from moving and working a double shift, I decided to test the building's supposedly unreliable Wi-Fi. To my surprise, my phone immediately connected to a strong signal labeled free connection that didn't require a password. The internet worked perfectly fast, stable, better than connections I'd paid good money for in the past. Streaming videos loaded instantly, web pages opened without delay. I felt guilty about my good fortune, certain there had to be some catch. Over the following weeks, I became dependent on the free connection. I could study online, stay in touch with friends, and stream entertainment without worrying about data charges or monthly bills. The signal never wavered, available 24 hours a day with consistent high speeds. But I began noticing strange things about my internet usage. Sometimes I'd wake up to find browser windows open to websites I'd never visited, social media profiles, blog posts, online forums discussing depression and social isolation. Initially, I assumed I'd been browsing absent-mindedly before falling asleep, though I didn't remember looking at those particular sites. The social media profiles were the most unsettling. They belonged to young people around my age, university students, part-time workers, people struggling with employment and housing just like me. Their posts painted pictures of increasing desperation, job rejections, family disappointment, mounting debt, social isolation. But when I tried to interact with these profiles, sending messages or friend requests, I always received error notifications. This account is no longer active or user not found. One night in October, I woke around 2 in the morning to the soft glow of the laptop screen. The computer had turned itself on and was displaying a social media profile I'd never seen before. The profile belonged to someone named Takeshi Yamamoto, 22 years old. His photos showed a thin young man with tired eyes, always alone in what looked like convenience store or net cafe environments. His most recent post was dated 6 months ago. Can't keep pretending everything's okay. No one would miss me anyway. Thanks to everyone who tried to help. Below that final post were dozens of comments from concerned friends and family members, growing increasingly frantic as days passed without response. Takeshi-kun, please call me back. Your mother is worried sick. We're here for you. I clicked on his profile information and felt my blood chill. Listed under previous addresses was this exact building, Unit 205, during the period when it still operated as Net Cafe Shibuya 24. The next morning, I researched the building's history online. Net Cafe Shibuya 24 had operated from 2015 until 2022, serving the growing population of Net Cafe refugees, young people who couldn't afford proper housing and slept in 24-hour internet cafes. Local news articles mentioned several incidents at the cafe. In 2019, a 22-year-old man was found dead in booth number 5 from apparent suicide. In 2020, a young woman overdosed in the women's section. Another suicide occurred in 2021. This time, a university dropout who had been living at the cafe for 8 months. All of them had been regular customers who spent their days and nights online, using social media as their primary connection to the outside world. I tried to dismiss these discoveries as coincidence, but the strange internet activity continued. More profiles appeared on my screen during the night, always belonging to young people who had posted about depression, job struggles, housing insecurity, always ending with final posts that suggested suicide, followed by worried comments from people who would never receive replies. The most disturbing part was how current some of the activity seemed. I would find status updates posted just hours earlier, as if these accounts were still active. But whenever I investigated during daylight, the profiles appeared abandoned or deleted. One night in November, I decided to stay awake and observe what actually happened. Around 1:30 in the morning, the laptop screen flickered to life. Without any input from me, browser windows began opening automatically, navigating to various social media sites. I watched, transfixed, as the cursor moved on its own, typing login credentials for accounts I'd never created. The first profile that loaded belonged to a young woman named Yuki Tanaka. Her photos showed someone about my age wearing convenience store uniforms, looking exhausted in every image. Her posts chronicled a familiar story: job rejections, family pressure, mounting debt, social isolation. But as I watched, new posts began appearing in real time, typed by invisible fingers. Still here, in the dark. Still connected. No one remembers us, but we remember each other. Other profiles loaded in additional browser windows. Takeshi, whose profile I'd seen before, and several others. A chat window opened between them, displaying a conversation happening live. Takeshi, new person in 207. She's been reading our profiles. She seems kind, not like the others who just used our connection and ignored us. A third voice joined. Maybe she'll understand. Maybe she'll listen. My hands trembled as I realized they were discussing me. Against my better judgment, I typed a response in the chat. I can see your messages. Who are you? The typing stopped for several seconds. Then Takeshi replied, we lived here when it was still the cafe. We died here, but our accounts are still active, still connected. This is the only place we still exist. Yuki added, the internet was our lifeline when we were alive, our only connection to people, to hope, to the possibility that someone might care. When we died, we couldn't let go of that connection. Over the following weeks, these late-night conversations became routine. The spirits of former net cafe refugees would use my computer to maintain their online presence, desperately clinging to the social media accounts that had been their primary connection to the world when they were alive. They told me their stories through typed messages. Takeshi had been a university dropout who lost his part-time job and couldn't afford rent. He'd lived in the net cafe for 4 months, sleeping in the booth during allowed hours and wandering the streets when the cafe closed for cleaning. Social media had been his only way to maintain contact with former classmates and family members who gradually stopped responding to his increasingly desperate messages. Yuki had worked multiple part-time jobs, but could never save enough for an apartment deposit. The net cafe provided cheap overnight accommodation, but the social isolation was crushing. Her online friends were the only people who knew about her struggles, the only ones who offered emotional support when her family grew tired of her problems. Others had similar stories, young people trapped between traditional family expectations and modern economic realities, using internet connections as their sole lifeline to human contact and emotional support. We can't rest, Takeshi explained during one of our conversations. Our online selves are all that remain. If these accounts disappear, we'll be completely forgotten, like we never existed at all. I began to understand the true nature of my free internet connection. The building's network wasn't just providing service, it was maintaining a digital afterlife for people who had died, with their most important relationships existing only online. The realization was both heartbreaking and terrifying. These spirits weren't malevolent, but they were trapped in a cycle of digital dependency that had followed them beyond death. What can I do to help? I asked during one of our late-night sessions. Just remember us, Yuki replied. Tell people our stories. We were real people with real struggles. We weren't just statistics or social problems. I started documenting their stories, taking screenshots of their posts and conversations before they disappeared in the morning. I researched their real identities, finding obituaries and news articles about their deaths. Most had been dismissed as isolated incidents, individual failures rather than symptoms of larger social problems. But I also noticed changes in my own life. The constant exposure to their despair and isolation was affecting my mental health. I found myself staying awake later, spending more time online, feeling increasingly disconnected from real-world relationships. One night, Takeshi expressed concern. You're starting to look like us in our final photos. Tired, isolated, spending all your time online. Be careful, Haruka-chan. Don't let our fate become yours. His warning made me realize I was falling into the same patterns that had trapped them, using internet connections to replace real human contact, allowing digital relationships to become my primary emotional support system. I began making conscious efforts to maintain offline relationships and activities. I joined a study group at the library, made conversation with regular customers at work, called family members more frequently. The contrast between digital and physical interactions became starkly apparent. The spirits noticed my changes during our conversations. You're pulling back from us, Yuki observed. I have to, I explained. I can't help you if I become trapped like you were. They seemed to understand, though their disappointment was obvious. Our conversations became less frequent as I spent more time engaged with the physical world. But I didn't abandon them completely. Instead, I found a different way to honor their memory. I started a blog documenting the stories of net cafe refugees, drawing attention to the social and economic pressures that led to their situations. I shared their experiences without identifying them personally, respecting their privacy while highlighting the systemic issues they had faced. The response was significant. Other people shared similar stories, creating a community of support around housing insecurity and social isolation. Some readers reached out for help with their own struggles, allowing me to connect them with resources and support groups. During one of my last conversations with the spirits, Takeshi seemed different, less desperate, more at peace. "People are reading about us," he said. "They're understanding what we went through. Maybe our deaths weren't completely meaningless." "You're giving us a different kind of immortality," Yuki added. "Not just digital accounts that nobody sees, but real impact on real people's lives." Gradually, their presences became less frequent. The laptop stopped turning on automatically at night. The mysterious social media profiles became inactive. But the free internet connection remained, as if the building itself had been permanently altered by their need to stay connected. I still live in Unit 207, though I've since gotten my own internet plan to reduce dependence on the mysterious connection. Sometimes, late at night, I still find browser windows open to social media profiles. I don't recognize new spirits perhaps, or echoes of the old ones. But now I know how to respond. I document their stories, share their experiences appropriately, and work to address the social conditions that led to their isolation and despair. The internet connection taught me something important about modern life. Digital relationships can provide crucial support, but they can never completely replace human contact and community. The spirits trapped in this building represent the extreme end of social isolation people, whose online connections became their only connections, leaving them vulnerable when those digital lifelines proved insufficient. I use their story as a reminder to maintain balance, to value both digital and physical relationships, and to remember that behind every social media profile is a real person with real needs for connection and support. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I was led to this apartment, not just for cheap rent, but to serve as a bridge between the digital dead and the living world, helping their stories find new life in the actions of people who might otherwise repeat their fate. The free internet connection continues, a permanent reminder of people who needed to stay connected so desperately that even death couldn't break their digital bonds. The vending machine money. My name is Ito Kenji, and I live in a ground floor apartment in Sumida that faces the street. At 68 years old, I've learned to appreciate the small routines that keep life predictable. But some routines, I've discovered, persist even after death. It started 3 months ago, in late February of 2024. Every morning when I opened my door to collect the newspaper, I found coins scattered on the concrete outside. Never many, just a few pieces, totaling exactly 120 yen. Old 500 yen coins with designs I hadn't seen in circulation for years, tarnished 50 yen pieces, and occasionally commemorative coins from events decades past. At first, I assumed children were playing pranks, or perhaps someone was dropping pocket change while walking by. The coins always formed a scattered trail, leading from my door toward the vending machine at the corner of our building, one of those typical drink and snack machines that serve every residential area in Tokyo. I would collect the coins each morning and put them in a small jar, thinking eventually the owner might return looking for them. But as weeks passed and the pattern continued without variation, I began to feel uneasy about this mysterious daily gift. The building where I live is typical for this area. 5 stories of small apartments, housing mostly single residents, elderly people like myself, young office workers, university students, and a few families with children. It's the kind of place where neighbors acknowledge each other politely, but rarely engage in conversation beyond basic greetings. but I knew something about the third-floor apartment directly above mine. For the past 3 years, a young man named Tanaka had lived there as what people call a hikikomori, someone who withdraws completely from social life, rarely leaving their room. I had occasionally seen him late at night, always alone, making quick trips to that same vending machine outside our building. His routine was remarkably consistent. Around 11 p.m., I would hear soft footsteps on the stairs, then see a thin figure in a hooded jacket approach the vending machine. He would buy the same items every night: a can of coffee and a rice ball from the food compartment. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes, and he would disappear back into the building without making eye contact with anyone. I learned his name from building notices and the occasional delivery that required my signature when he wasn't available to receive packages. The landlord, Watanabe-san, sometimes mentioned concerns about late rent payments or complaints from other tenants about unusual smells coming from his apartment. Young people these days, Watanabe-san would say, shaking his head. His parents send money, but he barely takes care of himself. Very worrying situation. In December of 2023, I stopped seeing Tanaka make his nightly visits to the vending machine. The building became quieter, but I didn't think much about it initially. Hikikomori often go through periods of even deeper withdrawal. Then, in January, emergency services came to the building. Paramedics carried a covered stretcher down from the 3rd floor, while police officers questioned Watanabe-san. From fragments of conversation I overheard, I learned that Tanaka had died alone in his apartment, apparently from malnutrition and complications related to his prolonged isolation. Nobody realized, Watanabe-san explained to concerned neighbors. He had been dead for several weeks before anyone noticed. His parents hadn't heard from him, but that wasn't unusual. The smell finally prompted complaints. The tragedy affected me more than I expected. This young man had lived directly above me for 3 years, following his careful routine, struggling with problems I couldn't fully understand, and ultimately dying alone while I went about my daily life just below him. After his death, his apartment remained empty. His family cleared out his belongings quickly and quietly, avoiding contact with other tenants. The building felt different somehow, as if a sad but familiar presence had been permanently removed. That's when the coins started appearing. Every morning, without exception, I would find exactly 120 yen in old coins scattered outside my door. The trail always led toward the vending machine, ending at the exact spot where Tanaka used to stand during his nightly purchases. 120 yen, exactly the cost of a canned coffee and rice ball from that machine. Initially, I tried to rationalize the phenomenon. Perhaps other tenants were playing an elaborate prank, or maybe coins were falling from someone's pocket during their daily routines. But the consistency was unsettling. Always the same amount, always the same path, always the same denomination of old coins that seemed to come from a different era. I began paying closer attention to the Dekkar building's nighttime activities. Around 11 p.m., the time when Tanaka used to make his purchases, I would position myself near my window to observe the street. For weeks, I saw nothing unusual, just the normal late-night activity of a residential neighborhood. But one night in March, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The vending machine was glowing more brightly than usual, its display panels flickering with an unusual intensity. The soft hum of its refrigeration system seemed louder, more insistent, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a thin figure in a hooded jacket standing in front of it. When I looked more carefully, no one was there. But the machine's money slot was opening and closing repeatedly, and I could hear the mechanical sounds of items being dispensed, though nothing actually dropped into the retrieval compartment. The next morning brought the usual trail of coins, the same old 550 yen pieces leading from my door to the vending machine. I decided to investigate Tanaka's background more thoroughly. During conversations with Watanabe-san and long-term residents, I learned more about his situation He had been a university student who developed severe social anxiety and depression, gradually withdrawing from classes, friends, and eventually all human contact, except when absolutely necessary. His parents sent money every month, one neighbor told me. They tried to visit several times, but he wouldn't answer the door. They were very worried, but what can you do when someone refuses help? His daily routine had been minimal. Sleep during the day, stay awake at night, survive on convenience, food, and whatever he could buy from the vending machine. The coffee and rice ball represented his primary nutrition for months before his death. It was the only time anyone ever saw him, another tenant mentioned. Like clockwork, every night around 11, made you feel sad, watching this thin young man buying the same food, looking so alone. As the weeks continued, the nightly phenomena intensified. I began hearing footsteps on the stairs around 11 p.m., always the same pattern. Slow, hesitant steps descending from the third floor to the ground level. But when I checked the hallway, it was always empty. The vending machine itself seemed to be responding to an invisible presence. Its lights would flicker, buttons would illuminate without being pressed, and occasionally I would hear the mechanical dispensing sounds, followed by the thud of items dropping, though the retrieval compartment remained empty. One night, I decided to confront whatever was happening directly. At 10:55 p.m., I positioned myself in the building's entrance, hidden but with a clear view of the vending machine. Exactly at 11 o'clock, I heard the familiar footsteps on the stairs. They descended slowly, paused at each landing, then continued down to the ground floor. The front door opened without anyone visible pushing it, and I felt a cold draft pass by me. At the vending machine, I watched in fascination and horror as buttons pressed themselves. The coffee selection illuminated, followed by the rice ball option. Coins that weren't there seemed to drop into the money slot. I could hear the metallic clinks clearly. The machine processed the transaction, dispensing items that immediately vanished. Then, as if suddenly aware of my presence, the activity stopped abruptly. The vending machine's lights returned to normal, the mechanical sound ceased, and the cold presence seemed to dissipate. But the next morning, as always, I found the trail of coins leading from my door to the machine. I began researching hikikomori cases and the psychological patterns of extreme social withdrawal. What I learned was deeply disturbing. People in Tanaka's situation often develop such rigid routines that these patterns become their entire connection to existence. The nightly trip to buy food wasn't just about nutrition, it was his only acknowledgement of the outside world, his only proof that he still participated in life. When someone dies with such profound attachment to routine, especially when that routine represents their sole connection to the world, traditional belief suggests the spirit may be unable to let go of these patterns. I consulted with a Buddhist monk at a nearby temple, explaining the situation carefully without mentioning supernatural elements directly. Spirits of people who died in isolation often remain attached to their final routines. He told me, these patterns represented their last connection to life. Sometimes they need help understanding that their earthly obligations have ended. He suggested I might serve as a bridge between the spiritual world and the living community, helping the departed soul find peace. That night, I prepared for Tanaka's usual visit differently. Instead of hiding and observing, I waited openly by the vending machine with the coins that had been left outside my husband's door. At 11 p.m., the familiar presence approached. I could feel the coldness, hear the soft footsteps, sense someone standing near the machine. "Tanaka-san," I said softly to the empty air. "I've been collecting the money you've been leaving. You don't need to keep following this routine." The vending machine's lights flickered, and I felt a profound sadness emanating from the invisible presence. "You're not alone anymore," I continued. "People in the building remember you. Your parents grieved for you. Your routine mattered to all of us, even when you thought no one was paying attention." The cold intensified. and I heard what sounded like quiet sobbing. "It's okay to rest now," I said gently. "You don't have to keep buying food you can't eat. You don't have to maintain the routine that kept you alive. You can let go." For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the presence began to fade. The cold dissipated, the vending machine's lights stabilized, and the street returned to its normal late-night quietness. The next morning, for the first time in months, I found no coins outside my door. But the experience changed my daily routine permanently. Every evening around 11 p.m., I make a point of spending a few minutes near that vending machine, not because I expect supernatural activity, but because I want to remember Tanaka and others like him who struggle with isolation and social withdrawal. I also began volunteering with local organizations that support hikikomori and their families, trying to provide the kind of community connection that might have helped Tanaka when he was alive. The building feels different now, not haunted exactly, but somehow more aware of the lonely people who live within its walls. Other tenants have begun greeting each other more often, checking on elderly neighbors, and creating the small social connections that can make the difference between life and death for someone struggling with isolation. Sometimes I wonder if that was Tanaka's real message, not a ghostly persistence of routine, but a reminder that everyone needs some connection to the community around them, even if it's just the acknowledgement of shared humanity, represented by buying coffee and a rice ball from the same vending machine every night. The coins never returned, but I kept the ones I had collected in a small memorial jar. They serve as a reminder that even the smallest routines can represent someone's entire connection to life, and that paying attention to the lonely people around us isn't just kindness. Sometimes it's literally the difference between life and death. In a city of millions, it's easy to overlook the quiet struggles happening just above your head or behind the next door. Tanaka's ghost taught me that those struggles matter, that isolation kills, and that community, even the most minimal acknowledgement of shared existence, can be a lifeline for someone drowning in loneliness. I still live in that same ground floor apartment, still collect my newspaper each morning, still maintain my comfortable routines. But now I also watch for the signs of neighbors who might be following routines that represent their last connection to the world, hoping to offer them something more substantial before it's too late. The vending machine still operates normally, serving the building's residents with their daily needs. But every night, around 11 p.m., I remember a young man who needed more than coffee and rice balls to survive, and I try to ensure that no one else in our building has to face their struggles completely alone. The Family Registry. My name is Nakamura Yuki, and I work as a family registry clerk for Sumida Ward Office. Due to budget cuts in 2023, many of us were reassigned to work from home, processing routine paperwork from our apartments to reduce office overhead costs. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement until the dead began filing their own documentation. My home office is set up in a small apartment in Mukojima, where I handle address changes, family registrations, and residential status updates for ward residents. The work is methodical but important, maintaining accurate records of who lives where, family relationships, and legal residency status for tax and administrative purposes. The paperwork comes to me through various channels: mail delivery, digital submissions through the ward website, and occasionally hand-delivered forms slipped under my door by residents who prefer to file in person but can't make it to the main office during business hours. It was this last category that first caused me concern. In March of 2024, I began finding address change forms under my door that seemed unusual. They were always filed correctly, proper forms, neat handwriting, exact filing fees included, but they were submitted by people requesting to change their registered address back to apartments where they had previously lived. This wouldn't be unusual except for one disturbing detail. According to our ward death registry, all of these applicants were legally deceased. The first case involved Tanaka Hiroshi, age 34, who had died in his apartment 6 months earlier from what the medical examiner determined was suicide by hanging. His address change form requested that his registered residence be changed from his parents' house in Saitama back to apartment 302 in a building on Sumida River Boulevard, the same apartment where he had died. The handwriting on the form perfectly matched samples in our files from when he had originally registered to live at that address 3 years earlier. The filing fee was included, exactly 300 yen, in coins that carried a strange smell like temple incense. I assumed this was some kind of administrative error or perhaps a cruel prank by someone who had access to his personal information. I set the form aside to investigate later, but more similar applications began appearing. Within 2 weeks, I had received address change forms from 7 different deceased residents, all requesting to return their registered residence to apartments where they had died. Each form was filled out perfectly in handwriting that matched our official files. Each included the proper filing fee in coins that smelled like incense and temple offerings. The cases varied in circumstances, but followed a disturbing pattern. Sato Keiko, a 42-year-old woman who had died from a heart attack while alone in her apartment, requested to change her address back from her sister's house to her original unit. Yamamoto Takeshi, an elderly man who had passed from natural causes, wanted his residence changed from his son's address back to the apartment where he had lived independently for 15 years before his death. All of them had been found dead in the apartments they now wanted to register as their official residence. I consulted with my supervisor, Ishida-san, about these unusual submissions during our weekly video conference. "Are you certain the handwriting matches our files?" he asked, looking concerned. "I've compared them carefully. The signatures are identical. The writing style, the way they form certain characters, it's definitely the same people who originally filed these registrations." Ishida-san was quiet for a moment. "Have you verified their death certificates against the submissions?" "Yes. All of them are definitely deceased according to our records, but someone is filing paperwork on their behalf with perfect accuracy and correct fees. Family members, perhaps, handling final administrative matters? That's what I thought initially, but the requests don't make sense. Why would living family members want to change a dead person's registered address back to the apartment where they died? And why would they be able to replicate the handwriting so perfectly?" We agreed that I should continue collecting these forms and documenting the pattern while he investigated whether similar cases were occurring in other districts. Over the following weeks, the submissions became more frequent. Every few days, I would find new address change forms under my door, always filed by deceased residents, always requesting to return to apartments where they had died. I began researching the specific addresses mentioned in these forms. Most were in older apartment buildings throughout Sumida Ward, typically smaller units in buildings that catered to single residents or elderly tenants. Many were classified as Jiko Buken Properties apartments where unnatural or sudden deaths had occurred. The landlords of these buildings faced legal requirements to disclose the deaths to potential tenants for 3 years, which significantly reduced the rental value and desirability of the units. Several of the apartments mentioned in the forms remained vacant months after the deaths, unable to attract new tenants despite reduced rent prices. One evening in April, I decided to visit one of the addresses to investigate the situation directly. Tanaka Hiroshi's apartment building was a 5-story structure built in the 1980s, typical of middle-income housing in the area. The building superintendent, Ogawa-san, was an elderly man who had worked there for over a decade. Apartment 302 has been empty since Tanaka-san died. He told me when I explained my official purpose for visiting. Very sad case. He was a quiet tenant, never caused problems, but he struggled with depression after losing his job. Have you noticed any unusual activity around the apartment since his death? Ogawa-san looked uncomfortable. Nothing I could report officially, but sometimes I hear sounds from that unit. Footsteps, papers rustling. The electricity meter sometimes shows usage even though the power should be disconnected. Have you investigated? I have keys, but honestly, I haven't wanted to go in there alone. The atmosphere feels very heavy, very sad. And a few times, I've found papers slipped under the door, official-looking forms with his name on them. This matched the pattern I was seeing with the address change forms. Something was compelling these deceased residents to continue engaging with administrative processes, trying to maintain their legal connection to the apartments where they had died. I researched traditional beliefs about death and residence in Japanese culture. According to Buddhist teachings, spirits sometimes remain attached to locations where they experienced strong emotions or unfinished business. The concept of spiritual contamination suggests that intense experiences, particularly traumatic deaths, can leave lasting spiritual residue in specific places. But what I was encountering seemed more specific than general haunting. These spirits appeared to be engaging with modern bureaucratic systems, following proper procedures to maintain legal residence status. They understood current administrative requirements and had access to correct filing fees. I consulted with a Buddhist monk at a nearby temple, explaining the situation carefully, without revealing specific names or addresses, due to privacy concerns. Spirits who die with strong attachment to place sometimes struggle to understand their changed circumstances, he explained. They may continue following familiar patterns and routines, including administrative obligations they followed in life. Why would they want to maintain legal residence in places where they died? Perhaps they fear being forgotten or legally erased. Maintaining official residence status might represent their attempt to preserve their connection to the world of the living, their proof that they existed and belonged somewhere. This interpretation aligned with what I was observing. These weren't malevolent spirits trying to harm the living, but rather confused souls attempting to maintain their legal and administrative existence in the only way they knew how. As spring turned to summer, the volume of supernatural paperwork increased. I was receiving address change forms almost daily, sometimes multiple submissions in a single night. Each form was perfectly completed with accurate filing fees, but the administrative burden was becoming overwhelming. More concerning was the effect this work was having on my mental state. I spent my days processing paperwork, filed by dead people, verifying their signatures against files, and trying to maintain professional objectivity about an increasingly surreal situation. The coins included with each filing fee were particularly disturbing. They always smelled strongly of incense, as if they had been blessed or used in funeral ceremonies. Some were older denominations that hadn't been in circulation for years, suggesting these spirits had access to money from their lifetime that had somehow followed them beyond death. One night in June, I decided to stay awake and observe how these forms were actually delivered. I positioned myself near my front door around midnight, when most of the mysterious paperwork typically appeared. Around 2 a.m., I heard the soft sound of papers being slipped under my door. When I looked through the peephole, I saw nothing in the hallway. But when I opened the door immediately, I found a fresh stack of address change forms with filing fees, still warm to the touch despite no visible presence in the corridor. The top form was filed by Watanabe Sachiko, an 81-year-old woman who had died of natural causes in her apartment 4 months earlier. Her handwriting was shaky, but clearly hers, requesting to change her registered address from her daughter's house back to the apartment where she had lived independently for 20 years before her death. I realized these spirits were personally delivering their paperwork to me, trusting me as their official administrative contact to process their requests properly. But I faced an ethical and legal dilemma. I couldn't process address changes for deceased individuals, but refusing to acknowledge their paperwork felt like abandoning people who were desperately trying to maintain some connection to official recognition of their existence. I decided to consult with the Buddhist monk again, this time bringing some of the actual forms to demonstrate the scope of the problem. He examined the paperwork carefully, noting the perfect handwriting and the smell of incense from the coins. These spirits trust you to help them maintain their connection to legal existence. But they need to understand that death changes their relationship to administrative systems. How can I help them understand without simply ignoring their requests? Perhaps you could create a different kind of acknowledgement, not official processing, but recognition that their requests were received and their desire to maintain connection is understood. Following his suggestion, I developed a compassionate but clear response system. When I received forms from deceased residents, I would write formal acknowledgement letters, explaining that their registration status had been permanently archived due to their death, but that their connection to their chosen residence was noted and respected. I would place these letters under the doors of their former apartments, along with small offerings of incense and flowers, treating the response as a memorial service rather than bureaucratic rejection. Gradually, the flow of supernatural paperwork began to decrease. The spirits seemed to understand that their administrative needs had been acknowledged, even if they couldn't be processed through normal channels. But the experience changed my understanding of my work permanently. Behind every form I process, every address, change, and family registration, are real people with deep emotional connections to place and legal identity. The desire to belong somewhere, to be officially recognized as existing in a specific location, is so fundamental that it can persist beyond death. I still work from my home office, still process routine paperwork for Sumida Ward residents, but now I treat each form with greater attention to the human story it represents. Someone cares enough about their legal residence to file proper documentation, and that care deserves respect whether they're living or dead. The mysterious paperwork still appears occasionally, maybe once a month now instead of daily. I continue responding with acknowledgement letters and memorial offerings, helping these confused spirits understand their changed status while honoring their need for administrative recognition. My apartment has become an unofficial bridge between the world of the living and the dead, a place where those who can't let go of bureaucratic obligations can find someone who understands their need to maintain official connection to the places they called home. In a society where legal residence and family registration define so much of personal identity and social belonging, perhaps it's not surprising that some people can't bear to let go of these connections, even in death. They file their paperwork with the same care they showed in life, hoping that proper procedures and correct fees will earn them continued recognition in the official records of the living. I've learned that death doesn't end all obligations or desires. Sometimes it just transforms them into different kinds of paperwork, filed by those who refuse to be forgotten or administratively erased from the places where they lived, loved, and ultimately died. The Student's Desk. My name is Miki Sato, and I'm a 17-year-old high school student living in my aunt's apartment in Setagaya. When my parents sent me to Tokyo for better educational opportunities in 2024, they thought they were giving me the best chance at success. They had no idea I would be sharing my study space with a cousin who died trying to achieve the same dreams. The arrangement seemed perfect initially. My father's younger sister, Aunt Keiko, had a spare bedroom in her apartment that she was willing to let me use in exchange for help with household chores and a modest monthly payment from my parents. The location was ideal walking distance from a well-regarded high school and close to several Juku cram schools that could help prepare me for university entrance exams. "You'll use Yuki-chan's old room," Aunt Keiko told me when I first arrived, showing me a small but comfortable bedroom with a large wooden desk positioned near the window. She would have wanted another student to benefit from her study space. Yuki had been my cousin, 3 years older than me, who had lived with Aunt Keiko during her own high school years. I had vague memories of meeting her at family gatherings when we were younger, a serious, studious girl who always seemed to be carrying textbooks and talking about entrance exam preparation. "Where is Yuki-chan now?" I asked, noticing that Aunt Keiko's expression became sad when she mentioned her. She's no longer with us, Aunt Keiko replied quietly. She passed away 2 years ago during her final year of high school. Very sudden illness. But her desk is perfect for studying. She spent so many hours there working hard on her assignments. The desk was indeed impressive. A heavy wooden piece with multiple drawers, perfect lighting, and enough surface space for textbooks, notebooks, and reference materials. Everything was organized efficiently, as if designed by someone who understood the demands of serious academic work. I settled into my new routine quickly. Morning classes at school, afternoon juku sessions for additional instruction in mathematics and English, evenings at the desk working on homework and exam preparation. The study environment was excellent, and I felt motivated by being in Tokyo with access to better educational resources. But within a few weeks, I began noticing something strange about my academic performance. My grades improved dramatically, far beyond what seemed possible given my study habits. Mathematics problems that had challenged me for months suddenly made perfect sense. English grammar rules that had confused me were crystal clear. Even subjects I had never particularly enjoyed, like chemistry and Japanese history, became comprehensible and interesting. More puzzling was that I didn't feel like I was working any harder than before. If anything, I seemed to be studying less than I had in my hometown, yet achieving much better results. My teachers noticed the improvement immediately. Miki-chan, your work has become exceptionally detailed and accurate. My mathematics teacher, Suzuki-sensei, commented after returning a test where I had scored perfectly. Your problem-solving approach shows real sophistication. But when I looked at my test paper, I felt confused. The solutions were definitely in my handwriting, but I couldn't remember working through some of the more complex problems. The mathematical reasoning was beyond what I thought I was capable of, yet it was clearly written in my own pen. Similar things happened in other subjects. My English essays were more eloquent and grammatically perfect than anything I had written before. My Japanese history assignments included details and interpretations that seemed to come from sources I didn't remember consulting. At home, I began paying closer attention to my study routine. Every evening, I would sit at Yuki's old desk, spread out my textbooks and assignments, and work until I felt tired enough to sleep. But I started noticing small inconsistencies. Sometimes I would wake up in the morning to find my textbooks open to different pages than where I had left them. Practice problems I didn't remember starting would be completed in my handwriting. Notes in the margins of my textbooks appeared to be in my pen, but I couldn't recall writing them. The most unsettling discovery was finding additional homework assignments that I had apparently completed but had no memory of doing. These were always perfectly executed, with detailed work showing step-by-step solutions that demonstrated a deeper understanding of the material than I thought I possessed. One morning in October, I woke to find an entire mathematics assignment finished on my desk, 20 complex calculus problems, solved with precision and accompanied by neat explanatory notes. The handwriting was definitely mine, but I had gone to sleep the previous night planning to work on those problems in the morning. Aunt Keiko, I said, over breakfast, did you hear me working at the desk late last night? She paused while preparing my lunch. No, Miki-chan. You've always been very quiet with your studies. Why do you ask? I've been finding assignments completed in the morning that I don't remember finishing. It's been happening more frequently. Aunt Keiko looked troubled. Maybe you're working so intensively that you're studying in a kind of focused trance. Some students do that during exam preparation periods. But I knew that wasn't the explanation. The work being completed was beyond my current ability level, requiring knowledge and techniques I hadn't learned yet. Someone else was using my desk, my materials, and somehow producing work in my handwriting. The supernatural assistance became more obvious as autumn progressed. I would fall asleep over my books and wake up the next morning to find not just my homework completed, but additional practice problems worked through, supplementary reading notes prepared, and study schedules organized with detailed plans for exam preparation. My academic performance reached levels that amazed my teachers and classmates. I was scoring in the top percentiles on practice exams for university entrance tests, surpassing students who had been attending elite JUCO programs for years. But instead of feeling proud of my success, I felt increasingly unsettled. The knowledge I was gaining felt borrowed rather than earned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was doing the intellectual work while I received the credit. One evening in November, I decided to stay awake and observe what actually happened at the desk during the night. I pretended to fall asleep over my books around 10 p.m., but remained conscious and alert. Around midnight, I felt a subtle change in the atmosphere of the room. The air became cooler, and I sensed a presence settling at the desk beside me. Through barely opened eyes, I could see someone working a figure that looked like me, but moved with different mannerisms. The presence opened my textbooks with familiarity, as if she knew exactly where to find specific information. She worked through mathematics, problems with confident strokes, wrote detailed notes in perfect handwriting, and organized materials with practiced efficiency. For several hours, I watched this ghostly student work through assignments with intense focus and obvious academic skill. Her knowledge was extensive, her problem-solving approaches sophisticated, and her study techniques more advanced than anything I had developed. When morning light began filtering through the window, the presence gradually faded, leaving behind completed homework and detailed study notes that would help me excel in class that day. I finally understood what was happening, but I needed confirmation from Aunt Keiko. "Tell me the truth about Yuki-chan," I said to her that evening. "She didn't die from illness, did she?" Aunt Keiko's face went pale. "Miki-chan, why are you asking about this?" "Because she's still here. She's been helping me with my studies, working at the desk at night. I need to understand what really happened to her." After a long silence, Aunt Keiko began to explain the truth she had hidden from my parents and me. Yuki had indeed died during her final year of high school, but not from illness. The pressure of university entrance exams, combined with family expectations and her own perfectionist tendencies, had driven her to increasingly desperate study schedules. She would work 18-hour days, surviving on caffeine and determination, pushing herself beyond healthy limits. She became obsessed with getting into Tokyo University. Aunt Keiko told me, tears in her eyes. She felt like her entire worth as a person depended on entrance exam results. The pressure became unbearable. One night in December, during the final months before entrance exams, Yuki had taken her own life at the desk where she had spent so many hours studying. She had left behind a note saying she couldn't face the possibility of failing, that she would rather die than disappoint everyone who believed in her academic potential. "I found her there the next morning," Aunt Keiko whispered, still at the desk, surrounded by textbooks and practice exams. She had been working until the very end. The revelation explained everything I had been experiencing. Yuki's spirit remained attached to the desk and the academic pursuits that had defined her final years of life. She was still trying to complete the studying she felt she hadn't finished, still pursuing the academic success that had eluded her. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "I hoped that having another student use the room might help her find peace, and I thought it would be good for you to have such an excellent study space. I never expected her presence to be so active." I felt conflicted about this supernatural academic assistance. My improved grades were genuinely helping prepare me for university, but they weren't truly earned through my own efforts. I was benefiting from Yuki's continued obsession with academic achievement, but I was also witnessing the tragic persistence of the pressure that had killed her. Over the following weeks, I began trying to communicate with Yuki's presence during our shared study sessions. I would leave notes thanking her for her help, but also encouraging her to rest rather than continuing to pursue academic goals that no longer mattered. "You don't need to keep studying," I wrote in my notebook one evening. "You're already smart enough. You always were." The supernatural assistance began to change after I started acknowledging her presence directly. Instead of simply completing my assignments, Yuki seemed to focus on teaching me study techniques and problem-solving approaches. She would organize my materials to demonstrate more effective learning methods, highlight important concepts in my textbooks, and prepare study guides that helped me understand rather than just memorize information. I began to excel academically through my own understanding, rather than just supernatural completion of assignments. Yuki was no longer doing the work for me, but helping me develop the skills to succeed independently. But I also noticed that her presence was becoming sadder and more desperate. Sometimes I would find tear stains on completed assignments, or sense profound grief emanating from the desk during late-night study sessions. I consulted with a counselor at school about academic pressure and student mental health, learning about the resources available for students struggling with exam-related stress. I also researched the history of student suicide in Japan and the cultural factors that contribute to academic pressure. Many students feel like their entire identity depends on entrance exam results, the counselor explained. But success and failure in school don't determine someone's worth as a person or their potential for a fulfilling life. I began sharing these perspectives with Yuki through my notes and quiet conversations during our study sessions. I told her about classmates who had found happiness and success through various paths, not just academic achievement. I emphasized that her value as a person had never depended on test scores or university admission. Gradually, I felt her presence becoming more peaceful. The desperate intensity of her nighttime studying began to fade, replaced by a gentler assistance that felt more like guidance from an older sister than obsessive academic pursuit. One evening in February, as entrance exam season approached, I found a final note written in Yuki's handwriting on my desk. "Thank you for reminding me that I was enough, just as I was. Study hard, but remember that you are more than your grades. I can rest now." After that night, I no longer sensed her presence at the desk. But the study habits she had taught me, the organizational skills she had demonstrated, and the academic confidence she had helped me develop remained as her final gifts. I performed well on my entrance exams, not perfectly, but well enough to gain admission to a good university program. More importantly, I maintained perspective about the results. Success felt satisfying, but I knew it didn't define my entire worth as a person. I still use Yuki's desk for studying, but now it feels like a normal piece of furniture rather than a spiritually charged workspace. Sometimes I leave small offerings of flowers or incense there, treating it as a memorial to a cousin who worked too hard and expected too much of herself. The desk taught me important lessons about academic pressure, family expectations, and the danger of defining yourself entirely through achievement. Yuki's ghost showed me both the benefits of dedicated studying and the devastating consequences of taking that dedication too far. I'm now a university student in Tokyo, living in a dormitory and pursuing my own academic goals with healthy boundaries and realistic expectations. But I carry Yuki's memory with me as a reminder that learning should enhance life rather than consume it, and that no test or exam result is worth sacrificing your well-being or your life. Sometimes I visit Aunt Keiko and sit at the desk where Yuki and I shared so many hours of studying together. It's peaceful now, just a well-designed workspace in a quiet bedroom. But I remember her presence there, her desperate dedication, and her final acceptance that she was enough exactly as she was. The student's desk remains in that room, ready to serve future students who need a good place to study. But now, it also serves as a memorial to the importance of balance, self-compassion, and remembering that academic success, while valuable, is never worth more than the life of the person pursuing it. The Security Patrol. My name is Fujiwara Hiroshi, and I'm 71 years old. After 35 years working security at various office buildings throughout Tokyo, I retired in 2023 and moved to a modest apartment in Katsushika to live out my remaining years quietly. I never expected to continue my security work after death, though apparently not everyone gets that choice. The apartment complex where I live is typical for this area. A 5-story building constructed in the 1980s, housing mostly elderly residents, young families, and single workers who appreciate the affordable rent. The neighborhood has seen better days, with higher crime rates than more expensive districts, but the building itself seemed well maintained and secure. When I moved in, the landlord, Matsuda-san, mentioned that they were looking for someone to serve as volunteer building manager, handling minor maintenance issues, organizing resident meetings, and keeping an eye on building security. Given my background, I seemed like a natural fit for the role. The previous manager passed away suddenly last year, Matsuda-san explained. Nakamura-san had been with us for 8 years. Very dedicated, very thorough. Heart attack in the lobby while making his evening rounds. We miss his attention to detail. I accepted the volunteer position, figuring it would give me purpose during retirement and help me stay connected to the building community. The responsibilities were manageable, checking that exterior doors locked properly, ensuring emergency lighting functioned, coordinating with delivery services, and addressing resident concerns. But within my first month, I noticed something remarkable about the building's security situation. According to police reports and neighborhood association meetings, break-ins and petty theft had been significant problems in the area for years. Other apartment buildings regularly dealt with stolen mail, damaged locks, and unauthorized entries, but our building seemed completely immune to these issues. We used to have problems like everyone else, explained Tanaka-san, a longtime resident who lived on the 4th floor. But for the past year, nothing. No break-ins, no vandalism, no suspicious activity. It's like we have invisible protection. I assumed this was due to Nakamura-san's previous security work and hoped I could maintain the same high standards. But as weeks passed, I began noticing activities that couldn't be attributed to my own efforts. Every morning during my routine inspection, I found evidence that someone had already completed a thorough security check. Exterior doors that I remembered leaving slightly ajar were properly closed and locked. Windows that had been left open were secured. The building entrance, which occasionally didn't latch completely, was always properly sealed. More puzzling, residents began thanking me for security measures I hadn't implemented. "Thank you for checking my door lock last night, Fujiwara-san," elderly Mrs. Yamada told me one morning. "I heard you testing the handle around 3 a.m. I felt so much safer knowing you were being so thorough. But I had been asleep at 3 a.m., as I was every night. I kept regular hours and didn't make security rounds after 10 p.m. Similar comments came from other residents. They mentioned hearing careful footsteps in the hallways during the early morning hours, seeing a uniformed figure checking locks and windows, and feeling reassured by the presence of dedicated security patrols. I began staying awake at night to observe what was actually happening in the building. Around 2:30 a.m., I would hear the distinctive sound of soft footsteps in the corridor outside my first-floor apartment. The steps moved methodically from floor to floor, pausing at each apartment door and continuing to the next level. When I looked through my peephole or stepped into the hallway to investigate, I never saw anyone. But the security checks were definitely being performed by someone with professional knowledge and thoroughness. One night in November, I decided to follow the mysterious security patrol more directly. At 2:45 a.m., I quietly left my apartment and positioned myself at the stairwell where I could observe the hallway activities. I heard the familiar footsteps approaching from the upper floors, growing gradually closer. But when the sounds reached the second-floor landing where I was hiding, I saw nothing, just empty hallway illuminated by emergency lighting. However, I could observe the effects of an invisible presence. Door handles moved slightly as if being tested. Window latches clicked softly as they were checked and secured. The elevator call button illuminated briefly as someone pressed it, though no one was visible. The phantom security guard was conducting a professional patrol, methodically checking every potential entry point and security weakness with practiced efficiency. I researched Nakamura-san's background through building records and conversations with long-term residents. He had been a career security professional, working various positions throughout Tokyo, before taking the building manager role as a semi-retirement position. Everyone described him as intensely dedicated, taking his responsibility for resident safety very seriously. He worked here like it was a high-security office building. One resident told me, multiple patrols every night, detailed logs of everything he observed, constant attention to locks, lighting, and potential security risks. He used to say that protecting residents was a sacred trust, another neighbor added. He felt personally responsible for everyone's safety and security. The more I learned about Nakamura-san, the more I understood why his presence might persist in the building. He had died while performing his security duties, literally collapsing during an evening patrol. His sense of responsibility for resident protection had been so strong that death hadn't released him from his obligations. But rather than feeling frightened by this supernatural security assistance, I felt grateful. Crime in the area remained significant, but our building continued to be completely untouched. Whatever Nakamura-san was doing, it was effectively protecting everyone who lived there. I began leaving small signs of acknowledgement for his continued service. I would place a cup of tea in the lobby before going to bed, which was always empty by morning. I left brief notes thanking him for his dedication and assuring him that I was trying to maintain his high standards during my daytime responsibilities. The phantom patrols continued throughout the winter, and residents remained grateful for what they assumed was my exceptionally thorough security work. I accepted their thanks gracefully, while knowing the real credit belonged to my predecessor. One evening in February, I experienced direct contact with Nakamura-san's presence. I had been reviewing building maintenance records in the lobby around 10 p.m. when I felt someone sit down beside me on the small bench near the mailboxes. The air became cooler, and I sensed a strong presence despite seeing nothing. "Thank you for taking care of the building," I said quietly to the empty space beside me. After a moment, I heard a voice, barely a whisper, but clearly audible. "Residents must be protected. It's our duty." "You're still doing excellent work," I replied. "Everyone feels safe here. Cannot rest while people are in danger. Too many bad things happen when security fails." I understood his dedication completely, having spent my own career focused on protecting people and property. But I also recognized the sadness in his voice, the burden of someone who couldn't let go of responsibilities that had defined his entire identity. "The building is secure," I assured him. "You've done more than anyone could ask. Maybe it's time to trust that others can continue the work." The presence was quiet for several minutes. Then, "You understand the job. You know what matters." "Yes, I do, and I promise to maintain the security standards you established." Over the following weeks, I noticed gradual changes in the phantom security patrols. Nakamura-san's presence became less desperate and urgent, more collaborative and peaceful. Instead of compulsively checking every lock multiple times per night, he seemed to be working alongside me, supplementing my daytime efforts rather than frantically trying to handle all security responsibilities alone. The building remained completely safe from break-ins and theft, but the supernatural assistance began to feel more like guidance from an experienced colleague rather than the obsessive patrolling of someone who couldn't let go of earthly duties. Residents continued to comment on the excellent security, though they noticed the nighttime sounds becoming softer and less frequent. "You've made us all feel so protected, Fujiwara-san," Mrs. Yamada told me one morning. "Even the atmosphere feels more peaceful lately." I realized that Nakamura-san was gradually finding peace with the arrangement. He had trained a capable replacement, established effective security protocols, and ensured continuity of protection for the residents he cared about so deeply. One night in March, I found a brief note in the lobby written in careful handwriting. Building secure. Residents safe. Thank you for understanding the duty. Rest well. After that night, the phantom security patrols became much less noticeable. I still occasionally heard soft footsteps during early morning hours, but they seemed more like periodic check-ins than desperate, compulsive patrolling. The building's crime-free status continued, but I knew I had inherited both the responsibility and the methods that made this protection possible. Nakamura-san had taught me, through example and supernatural mentorship, how to provide truly effective security for apartment residents. I'm now approaching my second year as volunteer building manager, and our complex remains the safest in the neighborhood. My security work combines traditional professional techniques with insights learned from observing Nakamura-san's dedicated approach. Sometimes, during my evening rounds, I still feel his presence accompanying me, not frantically checking locks, but walking alongside as a senior colleague, ensuring I understand all aspects of the job. I've learned that true security work isn't just about preventing crime. It's about creating an atmosphere where residents feel genuinely protected and cared for. Nakamura-san showed me that this responsibility doesn't end with retirement or even death if you take your duty seriously enough. The building remains completely free of break-ins, vandalism, and theft. Residents feel safe walking in the hallways, leaving packages unattended, and trusting that someone is always watching out for their welfare. I maintain Nakamura-san's detailed logs, thorough inspection routines, and commitment to treating resident protection as a sacred responsibility. But I also try to balance dedication with the recognition that security work should enhance life rather than consume it entirely. Late at night, when I complete my final security check before bed, I sometimes pause in the lobby where Nakamura-san died. I express gratitude for his continued guidance and assure him that the residents remain safe under our combined protection. The building feels permanently blessed by his commitment to duty and his willingness to train a successor rather than simply abandoning his responsibilities. He found a way to let go of desperate, fearful patrolling while maintaining his essential protective presence. Sometimes I wonder if this is what the best security professionals become after death, not angry spirits guarding empty buildings, but wise mentors, helping ensure that important work continues with the same dedication and care they brought to their duties in life. I'm honored to serve alongside Nakamura-san in protecting this community, combining the experience of the living with the eternal vigilance of someone whose commitment to others' safety transcended even death itself. The Piano Practice Room. My name is Miyuki Hashimoto, and I teach piano lessons from my apartment in Nerima. At 38 years old, I've built a modest but steady career, giving private lessons to neighborhood children and adults, supplementing my income by teaching music theory at a local community center. Music has always been my passion, but recently it's become a source of profound sadness. My apartment is on the 4th floor of a building constructed in the 1990s, with decent sound insulation that allows me to teach without disturbing neighbors too much. I chose this unit specifically because the landlord approved of my music teaching activities, understanding that piano instruction requires reasonable sound transmission. When I moved in 3 years ago, I was delighted to discover that the resident directly below me, Suzuki-san, was also musically inclined. She was an 82-year-old widow who had played piano as a young woman and maintained a beautiful upright piano in her living room. "I'm so happy to have a music teacher living upstairs," she told me when we first met in the building's entrance. "My granddaughter, Yuki-chan, visits every week for piano lessons. It will be wonderful to have professional music in the building." Suzuki-san was a kind, elegant woman who had clearly been quite accomplished in her youth. Her apartment was beautifully maintained, with family photographs displaying decades of memories and a pristine piano that had obviously been carefully preserved. Her granddaughter, Yuki, was a sweet 12-year-old who showed genuine musical talent and enthusiasm. I would often hear them practicing together on Sunday afternoons. Suzuki-san's patient teaching voice, guiding Yuki through scales, simple pieces, and basic theory. The lessons were clearly precious to both grandmother and granddaughter. Through my floor, I could hear their laughter, Suzuki-san's gentle corrections, and Yuki's improving technique as weeks turned into months. But gradually, I began noticing tensions in the family dynamics. Yuki's parents, both busy professionals, seemed to view the piano lessons as an inconvenience rather than an opportunity. I occasionally overheard phone conversations when Yuki would call to cancel lessons due to other obligations, juku classes, school activities, family commitments that took precedence over time with her grandmother. Mama says, "I can't come today," I heard Yuki explain apologetically during one phone call in the hallway. She says piano lessons aren't as important as preparing for middle school entrance exams. Suzuki-san's disappointed, "I understand, dear," carried clearly through the thin walls. As Yuki entered her final year of elementary school in 2023, the lessons became increasingly infrequent. The pressures of academic preparation and her parents' ambitious educational plans left little time for what they considered recreational activities. "My mother doesn't understand why Oba-chan wants me to waste time on piano when I should be studying mathematics and English," Yuki confided to her grandmother during one of their last lessons together. "Music isn't waste, dear," Suzuki-san replied gently. "It feeds the soul in ways that test scores never can." But the family pressures continued mounting. Yuki's visits decreased from weekly to monthly, then to special occasions only. Each time she canceled, I could hear the sadness in Suzuki-san's voice as she accepted another broken commitment. The last lesson I heard them share was in October of 2023. They worked on a simple Bach piece that Yuki had been struggling with for months, finally achieving a breakthrough performance that made both of them laugh with joy. "See how beautiful music can be when you practice with patience and love?" Suzuki-san said after Yuki finished playing. "I wish I could come more often, Oba-chan, but Mama says I have to focus on more important things now that I'm starting middle school." "I understand. But remember, whenever you're ready to return to music, the piano will be waiting here for you." That was their final lesson together. Over the following months, Suzuki-san's apartment became quieter. No more Sunday afternoon lessons, no more telephone calls with Yuki, no more sounds of family visits or laughter drifting through my floor. I began noticing that Suzuki-san was practicing alone every evening around 6 p.m. the same time when Yuki's lessons used to occur. She would work through beginner exercises and simple pieces, as if maintaining her teaching skills for lessons that were no longer happening. The music was always melancholy, played with perfect technique but profound sadness. Sometimes I would hear her stop in the middle of pieces, as if waiting for a student's response that never came. When I encountered Suzuki-san in the building hallway, she seemed increasingly frail and isolated. She would mention Yuki occasionally, always with hope that the lessons might resume once middle school pressures decreased. "Children are so busy these days," she would say wistfully, "but I keep the piano tuned and ready for when Yuki-chan has time to visit again." In March of 2024, I realized I hadn't seen Suzuki-san for several weeks. Her apartment was completely quiet, no piano practice, no sounds of daily activities, no responses when I knocked to check on her welfare. The building superintendent confirmed what I had begun to fear. Suzuki-san had passed away alone in her apartment, apparently from heart failure. She had been dead for over a week before anyone noticed her absence. "Very sad case," he told me. She had no regular visitors in her final months. Her family cleared out her belongings quickly, but they couldn't take the piano, too big and expensive to move. The piano lessons had been the last meaningful connection in Suzuki-san's life, and when they ended, she had gradually withdrawn from the world entirely. But 2 weeks after her death, I began hearing piano practice again from the apartment below. Every evening at 6 p.m., exactly when Yuki's lessons used to occur, I would hear scales being practiced, the same beginner exercises that Suzuki-san had used to teach her granddaughter. The playing was technically perfect, but increasingly desperate, as if someone was frantically preparing for lessons that might resume at any moment. The music was always the same pieces: basic scales, simple Bach minuets, elementary Chopin waltzes that Yuki had been learning during their time together. But there was an urgency to the practice sessions that hadn't existed when Suzuki-san was alive. I assumed new tenants had moved in and acquired the piano, but when I checked with the building superintendent, he told me the apartment remained empty. "Too expensive to remove that piano," he explained. "It's still sitting there until the family decides what to do with it." But every evening, I continued hearing practice sessions from the supposedly empty apartment. The phantom piano lessons began affecting my own teaching. My students would comment on the music coming from below during our lessons. "Who's the pianist downstairs?" asked one of my adult students. "They practice the same pieces over and over, like they're preparing for something important." "Very dedicated practice routine," another student observed. "But they sound sad, don't they? Like they're playing for someone who isn't listening." I began staying after my evening lessons to observe the supernatural piano practice more closely. The music was definitely coming from Suzuki-san's apartment, but it had a hollow, distant quality that suggested something beyond normal sound transmission. One evening in April, I decided to investigate directly. Using my building key access, I entered the empty apartment during one of the 6 p.m. practice sessions. The apartment was completely vacant except for the upright piano, which sat exactly where it had been during Suzuki-san's lifetime. But as I watched, the keys were moving on their own, playing the familiar scales and exercises with invisible hands. The piano bench was positioned as if someone were seated there, and I could sense a presence, the feeling of someone playing with intense concentration and mounting desperation. On the piano's music stand, I found the same beginner books that Suzuki-san had used with Yuki, open to pieces they had practiced together. The pages showed wear patterns from months of use, margin notes in Suzuki-san's careful handwriting, providing guidance for a student who would never return. I spoke quietly to the empty room. "Suzuki-san, is that you?" The playing stopped immediately, and I felt a profound sadness emanating from the piano area. "Are you still preparing for Yuki-chan's lessons?" After a long silence, the piano played a few bars of the Bach piece that had been Yuki's breakthrough moment during their final lesson together, the last time they had shared joy in music. I understood then what was happening. Suzuki-san's spirit remained attached to her hope that Yuki would eventually return for piano lessons. She was maintaining her teaching skills, keeping the music alive, and preparing for a reunion that would never occur. Over the following weeks, I began leaving small offerings in the empty apartment: flowers, incense, and sheet music that might interest a devoted piano teacher. I also started playing some of the same pieces Suzuki-san had practiced, creating a kind of musical dialogue between our apartments. But the phantom practice sessions continued with increasing intensity. Suzuki-san seemed to be practicing more frantically, as if she believed that perfecting her teaching repertoire might somehow bring Yuki back. I researched Yuki's family and learned that she had enrolled in a prestigious middle school that required intensive academic focus. Piano lessons were considered a distraction from educational goals, and her parents had explicitly forbidden continued contact with her grandmother's interests. The family's attitude toward Suzuki-san's death was coldly practical. They had disposed of her belongings quickly, avoided discussing the emotional aspects of her isolation, and moved on with their lives as if the piano lessons had never mattered. But clearly, those lessons had mattered tremendously to both Suzuki-san and Yuki. The grandmother's spirit couldn't accept that this precious connection had been permanently severed by practical considerations and academic pressure. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about the situation, explaining that I wanted to help a spirit find peace while honoring the love she had felt for her granddaughter. Spirits who die with unfulfilled longing for family connection often remain attached to the activities that represented that bond. He explained, she needs to understand that her love was received and appreciated, even if circumstances prevented its continuation. Following his guidance, I began trying to communicate more directly with Suzuki-san's presence. During the evening practice sessions, I would sit in her empty apartment and listen to her phantom playing, offering verbal encouragement and acknowledging the beauty of her teaching methods. Your lessons meant so much to Yuki-chan, I would tell the invisible pianist. She learned to love music because of your patient guidance. The Bach piece you taught her was beautiful. She played it with such joy that last day. You were a wonderful teacher. Yuki was lucky to have a grandmother who shared music with such love. Gradually, the desperate quality of the practice sessions began to soften. Suzuki-san seemed to be accepting my acknowledgement that her teaching had been valuable, and her love for Yuki had been real and important. But the phantom lessons also began revealing something else. Suzuki-san wasn't just practicing for Yuki's return. She was also grieving the loss of her own musical expression, the joy she had found in sharing piano with someone who appreciated it. I started bringing my own students to practice in Suzuki-san's empty apartment occasionally, with permission from the building management. The piano was still in excellent condition, and the acoustics were wonderful for lessons. During these sessions, I could feel Suzuki-san's presence becoming more peaceful and engaged. She seemed to enjoy hearing music being taught and learned in her former home, even if the students weren't her own granddaughter. One evening in June, while teaching a young student in Suzuki-san's apartment, I noticed that the phantom presence was actually helping with the lesson. The student's technique improved beyond her normal ability, as if invisible hands were gently guiding her movements. I feel like someone is helping me play better, the student mentioned after finishing a piece particularly well. Maybe there's a music teacher's spirit here who wants to keep teaching, I replied, and I felt a warm presence respond to this acknowledgement. From that point on, Suzuki-san's presence became collaborative rather than desperate. Instead of frantically practicing alone in hopes of Yuki's return, she began participating in my lessons as an invisible teaching assistant. Students would often comment on feeling unusually guided and supported during lessons in that apartment. Their technique improved more rapidly, and they seemed to develop deeper emotional connections to the music they were learning. I continued using Suzuki-san's apartment for certain lessons, treating it as a memorial studio where her love of music and teaching could continue in a different form. The phantom piano practice became less frequent and more peaceful, as if she had found a new purpose that honored her original dedication to musical education. Sometimes, late in the evening, I still hear soft piano music from the apartment below, not the desperate practice sessions of earlier months, but gentle, contented playing that suggests a teacher at peace with her legacy. The piano remains in that apartment, serving as both memorial and functional instrument. Suzuki-san's presence continues to bless the space with her musical knowledge and teaching spirit, helping students connect with the beauty and emotional depth that music can provide. I often think about Yuki, now in middle school, and focused on academic achievement as her parents demanded. She probably doesn't know about her grandmother's death, or the months of lonely practicing that followed their separation. But in the quiet apartment below mine, Suzuki-san's love for her granddaughter lives on through music, transformed from desperate longing into generous teaching that helps other young people discover the joy that she had tried to share with Yuki. The piano practice room has become a place where musical love transcends family conflict and death itself, where a grandmother's devoted teaching continues to nurture young musicians even after her earthly relationships have ended. Sometimes I wonder if this is how all great teachers continue their work, not through specific students they hope to influence, but through the ongoing gift of knowledge and inspiration that touches anyone ready to receive it carrying forward the love and wisdom they had tried so hard to share with those closest to their hearts. The medical house calls. My name is Yamamoto Kenji, and I've been making medical house calls throughout Tokyo for 42 years. At 76 years old, I should have retired long ago, but elderly and homebound patients still need doctors willing to visit them in their apartments. What I didn't expect was that some of those patients would continue requesting my services even after death. I established my house call practice in the 1980s, when Tokyo's population was aging rapidly, and many elderly residents couldn't easily travel to hospitals or clinics. My specialty became treating isolated seniors in small apartments, people who had outlived their families, lost mobility, or simply felt more comfortable receiving medical care in familiar surroundings. Over the decades, I've seen thousands of patients in their homes, treating everything from routine checkups to final illness care. Many of my patients lived alone in budget apartments, relying on me as their primary medical contact and sometimes their only regular human visitor. The work has always been rewarding but emotionally challenging. Too often, I would arrive for scheduled visits to find that elderly patients had died alone since our last appointment, sometimes days or weeks before anyone discovered them. In March of 2024, I began noticing something unusual about my appointment scheduling. My receptionist, Sato-san, started receiving calls requesting house visits to addresses that seemed familiar but troubling. The callers would identify themselves as former patients, requesting treatment for the same conditions I had been treating them for before they passed away. "Dr. Yamamoto, this is strange," Sato-san told me one morning. "I received 3 appointment requests yesterday from patients who are listed as deceased in our files." She showed me the appointment book. Tanaka-san requesting a diabetes check at his apartment in Sumida, the same address where I had found him dead from diabetic complications 6 months earlier. Watanabe-san asking for blood pressure medication refills, but she had died of a stroke in her Adachi apartment the previous year. "Obviously, family members or new tenants are calling," I told Sato-san. "They probably found our contact information among the previous residents' belongings." But when I visited these addresses, I found empty apartments with no indication of current occupancy. Landlords confirmed that the units had remained vacant since the deaths occurred, considered too depressing or spiritually contaminated for most renters to accept. More disturbing was what I discovered about my medical equipment after these visits. My medical bag would show signs of use: stethoscope moved from its usual position, blood pressure cuff uncoiled, prescription pad missing pages. Sometimes I would find prescriptions written in my handwriting for medications appropriate to treat the conditions my deceased patients had suffered from. But I had no memory of writing those prescriptions or using my equipment during visits to empty apartments. The phantom house calls became more frequent throughout the spring. Almost daily, Sato-san would receive requests from deceased patients asking me to visit the apartments where they had died. The calls always came from phone numbers that were no longer in service, requesting treatment for the exact medical conditions that had ultimately killed them. "Mrs. Kimura called again," Sato-san would report. "She wants you to adjust her heart medication. But didn't she die of heart failure in February?" I started keeping more detailed records of these supernatural appointments, comparing them with my files on deceased patients. The pattern was clear. Every caller had died alone in their apartment, often after missing scheduled medical visits due to sudden deterioration of their condition. These were patients I hadn't been able to save, people who had died waiting for medical care that arrived too late, or not at all. One afternoon in May, I decided to stay during one of these phantom house calls to observe what actually happened. The appointment was scheduled for 2 p.m. at an apartment in Katsushika, where my patient, Suzuki-san, had lived before dying of pneumonia 3 months earlier. I arrived at the empty apartment and used my building access to enter the vacant unit. The apartment was completely empty, as expected. But as I sat in the main room with my medical bag, I began to sense a presence, the feeling of someone waiting patiently for medical examination. Without conscious decision, I found myself following my usual house call routine. I spoke aloud, as if greeting a patient, explaining what examinations I would perform. I opened my medical bag and began using my instruments as if examining someone invisible. "Good afternoon, Suzuki-san. How are you feeling today?" I felt compelled to check blood pressure, listen to breathing, and ask questions about symptoms, exactly the routine I had followed during our real appointments when she was alive. Throughout this phantom examination, I sensed responses from the invisible patient. Her breathing seemed labored. Her responses indicated persistent respiratory distress. Her condition appeared to match the pneumonia that had ultimately killed her. I found myself writing a prescription for antibiotics and respiratory medications, the same treatments I had tried to provide during her final illness, but which had been insufficient to save her life. When the phantom appointment concluded, I felt a profound sadness emanating from the empty room, as if my invisible patient was disappointed that medical treatment still couldn't cure her fatal condition. This pattern repeated during subsequent supernatural house calls. Deceased patients would present the same symptoms they had experienced before death, hoping that somehow I could now provide the successful treatment that had eluded us when they were alive. I began researching traditional beliefs about spirits and unfinished business. According to Buddhist teaching, people who die with strong attachments or unfulfilled needs may remain bound to earthly concerns, repeatedly seeking resolution for problems that can no longer be solved. My deceased patients seemed unable to accept that their medical conditions had progressed beyond treatment. They continued seeking the care and healing they had hoped for, calling me back to the apartments where they had died alone and suffering. The emotional burden of these phantom appointments was considerable. Each visit reminded me of patients I hadn't been able to save, medical limitations that had prevented successful treatment, and the loneliness these people had endured in their final weeks and days. But I also began to understand the deeper need these spirits were expressing. Many of my elderly patients had lived isolated lives, with medical appointments representing their primary human contact and source of care. I wasn't just their doctor, I was often their only regular visitor, the person who checked on their welfare and showed concern for their well-being. When they died alone, they lost not just their lives, but also their only reliable source of human attention and compassion. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about how to help these troubled spirits find peace. They seek healing for conditions that death has already resolved, he explained. But perhaps what they really need is acknowledgement of their suffering and assurance that their lives mattered to someone. Can medical care continue in spiritual form? I asked. Compassion transcends death. If you can provide comfort rather than cure, that might be what they truly need. Following his guidance, I began approaching the phantom house calls differently. Instead of attempting medical treatment that couldn't help deceased patients, I focused on providing the human compassion and attention they had valued during life. During supernatural appointments, I would sit in empty apartments and speak aloud to my invisible patients, acknowledging their suffering, expressing regret that medical treatment hadn't been successful, and assuring them that their lives had been meaningful and their struggles had been witnessed with care. "I'm sorry the antibiotics couldn't help your pneumonia, Suzuki-san. You fought very bravely against your illness. Your diabetes was challenging to manage, Tanaka-san, but you followed all my recommendations with such dedication. I wish I could have prevented your stroke, Watanabe-san. You deserved more time and better health." The phantom appointments began changing after I shifted focus from medical treatment to emotional acknowledgement. The desperate quality of the supernatural requests diminished, replaced by what felt like gratitude for continued attention and care. My deceased patients seemed to need confirmation that their medical struggles had been seen and understood, that their deaths hadn't been meaningless, and that someone remembered their attempts to maintain health and dignity despite difficult circumstances. The prescription sheets I found after phantom appointments also changed. Instead of medications for untreatable conditions, I began finding notes written in my handwriting that resembled final patient care instructions, recommendations for comfort, dignity, and peaceful acceptance rather than futile attempts at cure. Over the summer, the frequency of supernatural house call requests decreased gradually. My deceased patients seemed to be finding the peace they needed through acknowledgement rather than impossible medical intervention. But the experience changed my approach to living patients permanently. I became more aware of the emotional and social needs that medical appointments fulfill, especially for elderly people living alone. Sometimes, the most important treatment I can provide is simply showing up, listening carefully, and demonstrating that someone cares about their well-being. I also began paying closer attention to patients who might be at risk of dying alone, connecting them with social services, neighborhood support networks, and family members when possible. The goal isn't just treating medical conditions, but ensuring that people maintain human connections that can provide comfort during illness and aging. I still receive occasional phantom appointment requests from deceased patients, but they feel different now, less desperate, and more like gentle reminders to continue caring for the living patients who still need medical attention and human compassion. My medical practice has become a bridge between life and death, helping both living and deceased patients find the care they need. For the living, I provide medical treatment and human connection. For the dead, I offer acknowledgement of their suffering and assurance that their lives mattered. At 76, I'm gradually reducing my house call practice, but I continue serving elderly patients who might otherwise die alone and forgotten. Each appointment is an opportunity to provide not just medical care, but also the human attention that makes illness more bearable and death less frightening. The phantom house calls taught me that good medical care extends beyond successful treatment to include compassionate witness of human suffering. Sometimes the most important service a doctor can provide is simply being present during someone's struggle, whether that struggle ends in recovery or death. When I eventually retire, I hope my patients, both living and dead, will remember me as someone who showed up when called, listened to their concerns, and treated them with dignity, regardless of whether their conditions could be cured. The medical bag I carry contains not just instruments and medications, but also the capacity to provide comfort, attention, and human connection to people who might otherwise face their health challenges completely alone. In Tokyo's many small apartments, elderly people continue living and dying in isolation, but some are fortunate enough to have doctors willing to make house calls, providing not just medical care, but also proof that someone cares, whether they live or die, with dignity and companionship. That's a service worth providing for as long as patients living or dead continue to call for help. The Lost and Found. My name is Sasaki Tomoko, and I live in an apartment above what used to be the Shinjuku East Railway Lost Property Office. When I moved in during the summer of 2024, I thought the building's history was just an interesting footnote. I never expected to become an unwilling intermediary between the dead and their families, handling lost belongings that can never truly be returned. The building is typical of mixed-use structures near major train stations, commercial space on the ground floor with residential apartments above. The Railway Lost Property Office operated there for over 30 years before relocating to a larger facility in 2023, leaving behind decades of accumulated spiritual residue from items that carried deep emotional significance. When I signed the lease for the second-floor apartment, the landlord, Watanabe-san, mentioned the building's previous use almost casually. "Very convenient location," he said as we toured the small but well-lit unit, close to all train lines, and the ground floor used to handle lost items for the entire Eastern District. Thousands of people passed through that office over the years, trying to recover things they'd lost on trains. The apartment was affordable for the location, clean, and had good access to my office job in nearby Shibuya. The only minor inconvenience was that the ground floor remained vacant, creating an echo in the building and making it feel somewhat empty. I settled into my new home quickly, appreciating the convenience of being so close to major transportation hubs. My daily routine involved catching early morning trains, working long hours at an accounting firm, and returning home exhausted in the evenings. But within my first month, I began finding items outside my apartment door that definitely weren't mine. At first, it was small things. A leather wallet placed neatly on my doormat, a cell phone carefully positioned beside my shoes, reading glasses folded and set on the landing. I assumed other tenants were accidentally dropping belongings in the hallway and that I should return them. But when I asked neighbors about the items, no one claimed ownership. The wallet contained identification for someone I didn't recognize. The phone had no remaining battery charge, and the reading glasses prescription was much stronger than anything I or other residents would need. I brought the items to the building superintendent, Tanaka-san, thinking he could contact the owners or return them to the appropriate lost property office. "Strange," he said, examining the wallet. "This ID belongs to someone who died in a train accident 6 months ago. I remember reading about it in local news. Why would their wallet be in our building?" The pattern continued and intensified over the following weeks. Every few days, I would find personal belongings outside my door, always arranged neatly, never scattered or carelessly dropped. The items were diverse: wallets, phones, jewelry, books, small photographs, keepsakes that clearly held emotional significance for their owners. But when I researched the identification found in these belongings, I discovered a disturbing commonality. Every owner had died in railway-related incidents over the past 2 years. Train accidents, suicides, medical emergencies on platforms, all deaths connected to the transportation system that the Lost Property Office had served for decades. More unsettling were the small notes that began accompanying the found items, written in various handwriting styles on different types of paper. "Please return to my mother in Saitama. She will want my wedding ring back. My children live in Yokohama. The photos are important to them. Give this wallet to my wife. The receipts show where I was when I died." The requests were heartbreaking in their simple specificity. These weren't random lost items, they were final possessions of people who had died with unfinished business, trying to ensure their belongings reached surviving family members. I began keeping careful records of each item and note, researching the deceased owners through online obituaries and news reports. The stories were consistently tragic. People who had died suddenly or violently on the railway system, often leaving behind families who had never recovered all their personal belongings. One wallet belonged to a businessman who had suffered a heart attack on a crowded platform. His family had never found his work papers or the family photos he carried. Another item was a cell phone belonging to a university student who had died by suicide, jumping in front of a train. Her parents had been desperate to recover her phone, hoping to understand her final state of mind. The more I learned about these cases, the more I understood what was happening. The spirits of people who had died on the railway were still trying to use the lost property system to return their belongings to loved ones. They remembered the office that had operated in this building for 30 years, handling thousands of lost items and reuniting people with possessions they feared were gone forever. But now the office was closed, and these confused spirits were depositing their belongings with the only person still living in the building connected to their remembered system of recovering lost things. I researched traditional Japanese beliefs about death and attachment to personal possessions. According to Buddhist teaching, people who die suddenly or traumatically often remain bound to earthly concerns, particularly items that connected them to family relationships or personal identity. For railway death victims, personal belongings became especially significant because families often couldn't recover all possessions from accident scenes, leaving both the dead and the living with unfinished emotional business. The supernatural lost and found service became more active as autumn approached. I would wake up most mornings to find multiple items outside my door, each accompanied by handwritten notes requesting specific family delivery. The emotional burden was considerable. These weren't just random objects, they were final links between deceased individuals and their surviving loved ones. Each wallet, phone, or piece of jewelry represented someone's last connection to family members who were still grieving their loss. But I also began to understand that I was uniquely positioned to help both the dead and the living find closure. Unlike the formal railway lost property office, which dealt with administrative procedures and legal requirements, I could handle these spiritual returns with the compassion and discretion that both departed souls and bereaved families needed. I started actively researching the families mentioned in the notes, using information from the deceased's identification to contact relatives who might want to receive their loved ones' belongings. My first successful return involved a wallet belonging to a middle-aged man who had died in a train accident. His widow lived alone in Chiba, struggling with grief and regret over their final argument before his death. When I contacted her and explained that I had recovered some of his personal items, her reaction was overwhelming gratitude. "I thought I would never see his things again," she told me through tears when I visited her home. "The railway company said his belongings were lost in the accident. How did you find them?" I explained carefully that I lived in a building with connections to the lost property system, without mentioning the supernatural aspects that would be difficult for her to accept. She didn't need to understand the spiritual mechanics. She only needed to have her husband's final possessions returned with dignity and care. The wallet contained photos of their children, business cards from colleagues, and a grocery list written in his careful handwriting. For his widow, these mundane items were priceless connections to their shared life, and proof that he had been thinking about family responsibilities even on the day he died. Similar reunions followed throughout the autumn. I returned a student's cell phone to parents who had been desperate to understand their daughter's final months. I delivered a grandmother's jewelry to grandchildren who had never received any family heirlooms. I returned love letters to a widow whose husband had been carrying them when he died. Each successful return felt like completing a spiritual transaction that had been left unfinished by sudden death and administrative complications. But the emotional toll was significant. Every item I handled carried intense emotional energy, the love, regret, hope, and desperation of people who had died, with important business left undone. I was processing grief not just for the deceased individuals, but also for their families who had been struggling with loss and incomplete closure. I consulted with a Buddhist monk about my role in this supernatural lost property system. "You're serving as a bridge between the world of the dead and the living," he explained. "The spirits trust you to complete tasks they cannot finish themselves. This is compassionate work, but it requires protection to prevent their grief from overwhelming your own spiritual health." Following his guidance, I established protective rituals around my apartment and developed emotional boundaries that allowed me to help the dead while maintaining my own psychological well-being. I created a small shrine near my front door where I could properly acknowledge each spirit before attempting to return their belongings. I burned incense daily and offered prayers for the peaceful rest of souls who were struggling to let go of earthly attachments. The spiritual lost and found service continued through the winter, but the desperate quality of the deposits began changing. As I successfully returned more belongings to families, spirits seemed to understand that their possessions were reaching loved ones safely. The frantic notes requesting family contact were replaced by simple expressions of gratitude. "Thank you for helping. My wife received the ring. The children have their father's photos now." Gradually, the frequency of supernatural deposits decreased. The spirits who had been most desperately seeking family contact found peace through successful returns. Those whose belongings couldn't be returned to living relatives seemed to accept that some losses were permanent and that holding onto physical possessions wouldn't restore broken relationships. But the lost property deposits never stopped completely. Every few weeks, I still find items outside my door, usually belonging to more recent railway death victims who discovered my building's spiritual services through whatever communication network exists among the dead. I've developed efficient systems for researching deceased owners and contacting surviving family members. Sometimes successful reunions are possible. Sometimes families have moved or don't want painful reminders of their loss. But I always attempt to honor both the spirit's requests and the family's needs with equal compassion. My apartment has become an unofficial spiritual lost property office, serving people who died with belongings they desperately wanted to return to loved ones. The work is emotionally challenging, but also deeply meaningful, helping complete relationships that death had left unfinished. I've learned that lost belongings carry much more significance than their practical value. A wallet isn't just about money and identification. It represents someone's daily routine, their connection to work and family, their role in the world. A cell phone contains the final communications someone intended to share with people they loved. When these items are recovered and returned to families, they provide closure that goes beyond the objects themselves. They offer proof that their deceased loved one had been thinking about family responsibilities, carrying reminders of shared relationships, maintaining connections that death interrupted but couldn't destroy. The railway system continues operating as it always has, carrying millions of passengers daily through Tokyo's complex transportation network. But for those who die suddenly on trains or platforms, my apartment serves as a final stop, a place where spiritual lost property can be processed with care and returned to the living world with love. I remain in this apartment not just because the location is convenient for my own daily travels, but because I understand my role in helping both the dead and the living find peace through the return of belongings that carry irreplaceable emotional significance. In a city where millions of people pass through anonymous transportation systems daily, it's comforting to know that even in death, there are still ways to send final messages of love to family members through the simple return of personal possessions that prove relationships survive beyond the end of individual lives.